Good morning, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. Welcome to the SP&R Committee of Wednesday, the 17th of April 2019. I'd like to welcome you all along today. I would particularly like to welcome Gordon Patterson along as the new Director with the Council. Gordon, I wonder if you could stand up and everyone can recognise you, those who haven't met you before. Thank you very much. Gordon is the new Director of Health and Social Care, and we welcome him here today. Going on to the business of the day, do we have any apologies and substitutes?
Yes, we have Councillor McDaid subbing for Councillor Bailey, Councillor McEwen in place of Councillor Band, and Councillor Baird for Councillor Shires.
Okay, thank you. Before we begin the formal agenda, I have one item of urgent business that I wish to bring before the committee this morning. In the 1920 final revenue budget, which was approved in February 19, Sorry, are there any declarations of interest? Councillor Parrott.
Non-financial interest in item 7, thank you.
Okay. Councillor Baird. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. We'll move back to the urgent item of business. In the 1920 final revenue budget, which was approved in February 19, it included a proposal from the previous year's 1920 provisional revenue budget. This was to increase instrumental music charges for the forthcoming academic year. The financial implications of this increase are, in 1920, £50,000. The committee is asked to approve that the 1920 increase in charges on instrumental music is not applied. I actually have to move back one, if you'll excuse me. And I would ask that this motion to change instrumental music fees should be considered as a matter of urgency this morning. And to enable consideration of this matter, standing orders require to be suspended. And this is Standing Order 29B. In terms of Standing Order 4, the item is the only item of business to be suspended this morning. A roll call vote is required for the motion to be considered, and I ask that this roll call vote requires a 2/3 majority of those present today to be approved. So can I ask that we have a roll call vote as to whether we approve the suspension of standing orders to discuss this one item of business? Councillor Duggan.
Are you going to permit some debate, Convener, before we move to a vote?
I'd be happy to do that, yeah. Any comments or points at this stage? Councillor Duggan.
Can I ask, I appreciate you touched on it briefly in your introduction, Convener, can I ask for a procedural explanation as to what, on the basis that it appears your ambitions for the instrumental music service are inconsistent with the decisions that you took as an administration in February. Can I ask from officers exactly what the nature of that inconsistency is? Not the political element of it, because that's not appropriate for officers, but the budget setting element of the process which went wrong for your administration in February, just so we can be absolutely clear as to what it is we're being asked to accede to.
Stuart? Sorry, Mr Mackenzie.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you, Councillor Duggan. To clarify, last year in setting the 2018-19 revenue budget, the Council approved a position of moving to full cost recovery for instrumental music tuition services over a number of years, and that would have involved a 20% increase each year in music charges over a period of time to reach full cost recovery. And that is the position which Council approved in February 2019-20. 2019 for financial year 2019-20.
And is it correct to say, if I could have a supplementary convener, is it correct to say that this ambition for full cost recovery wasn't limited simply to instrumental music provision, it was limited to a whole host of chargeable services across the council?
Thank you, Councillor Dugan. There are a number of areas where the Council is seeking to move to full cost recovery. It hasn't already done so. However, specifically for music tuition, the position that Council approved last year was to move to full cost recovery over a number of years.
And the intention was it was solely instrumental music this year.
Thanks. Just to get the time frame of this, and it was implicit on page 121 of the budget papers that the price rise was there for everybody to see, so it was available for the public and all councillors to be aware of it from when these papers came out on the 13th of February. So when did the administration become aware that they'd passed their charge on that they put forward the previous year? When did they realise that they'd done this? Surely they would have recognised it when they were going through their papers before the February budget set meeting, which they all voted for to put up. Was this obviously, was this an error of judgment? You didn't see it, or has it been a U-turn since? That's my question.
No, for clarification, this was not, it's not a U-turn since. There was, and I use the word carefully, there was a misunderstanding between the administration and officers as to what the reality of this was. And this came to light during the budget debate. It came to light prior to the interval, the recess in the budget day, and was discussed during the interval. If you want to know exactly when it came to light, that is when it came to light.
But it was in the papers for weeks before.
I'm not denying that.
And stated down. So
I'm not denying. It was a misinterpretation.
The question I have,
on our
if you
part.
do a supplementary, is there's three elements to this music charges increase. Which elements are you wishing to strike down? There's the element on music instruction, which is going up. The council position at the moment is that it's going up. There's also the non-SQA study charge, which is going up by the same amount of money, and the central groups, which is going up by a percentage as well. Which element of the three charges are you wishing to rescind?
My understanding of it is the element that requires a 50% correction in the budget. Mr. Mackenzie,
I don't think it's 50% correction to budget, because that would be X amount of million. It must be
50,000.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kevin. My understanding is it's all three elements. The £50,000 would relate to all three elements.
So, just for clarity, the £50,000 is the sum that's accrued from all these increases.
That's my understanding of a 20% increase in charges.
In one financial year.
One financial year. Thank you.
Just for clarity, we're talking about rescinding all three charges increases.
Yes, which accumulates to £50,000 per annum. And what we are proposing is to take the money from reserves this year and deal with it in a future budget.
Okay. Well, I understand it's very important. The music charges are very important. Further down in that same page, or the next page, where I think sport and healthy living for children is very important. But I don't see any call on yourself to rescind the increase in charges for hiring of AstroTurf at the campuses, etc.
I think we're dealing with the subject before us today, and I would prefer to keep to that. So
yeah, mine's a comment, so it's within the appropriate time for this. I don't actually believe that we should be suspending the rules of the council to facilitate the administration's U-turn on its budget position. That's a long-held position of mine. I've been pretty consistent in that. I think people would recognise that. I think the council's rules are there for a reason, and I would quite often like the 6-month rule not to exist, but I accept that it does exist, and therefore I don't believe that we should just be suspending it on this occasion to facilitate a budget U-turn, so I will be voting against the suspension of standing orders on that basis.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Purvis.
Thank you, Convener. I will also be voting against the suspension of standing orders today. I do not think it is appropriate for us to be simply throwing out the rule book to correct an error on the administration's part. Clearly there was a fundamental understanding of the most basic principle of the way in which our budget process operates, that the previous year's decisions apply and are the baseline for the next budget. We can't pick and choose which rules we follow. I agree with Councillor McDade. I would like to see the 6-month rule removed, but that is something that we should do as part of a full review of the standing orders, and we can't just suspend standing orders to fix a mistake, so I won't be supporting the suspension of standing orders.
Okay, I'd just like to remind councillors that we are talking about the charges for children's music services, and before we get into wider debates about everything else, Councillor McEwen.
I'm sure I don't have a conflict of interest. I actually pay these charges because I have a daughter in the service. I'm sure that isn't a conflict of interest when it relates to budgetary matters. The balanced budget is set at full council with all councillors having an input. We're now being asked for 15 councillors to make a similar decision. I don't think that's fair on the councillors that are not here, that they can't input to the debate and to the conversation on a decision that they only made weeks ago.
Okay, thank you for your point. I would respond that the SPNR committee is the finance committee, essentially, of the council, but I take your point.
Convener, I'm happy to second your motion if that's required.
Convener, I'd like to request a very brief recess, please.
5 minutes. Okay, thank you. A 5-minute recess. Apologies. I sought clarification and had discussions with fellow councillors and taken advice from officers. And I now propose to withdraw the motion this morning, and I propose to bring forward the motion to full council, as this was a decision taken at full council, and I will do this at the first opportunity. I will bring this back to full council and go from that point. And I hope that's agreeable to all. The committee agreed to that. Right, thank you. Thank you all for your patience. And we now move on to item 3.1, or item 3 even, on the agenda, the minutes of the previous meetings. 3.1 is the SPNR committee of the 6th of February. Can we approve that? Agreed? Agreed. Do we have a copy for signature? Charlotte? Usually do it at the time. There we go. Thank you. Item 2, minute of the meeting of the Property Subcommittee of the 22nd of October for noting. Agreed. Minute of the special meeting of the Property Subcommittee of the 18th of December for noting. Agreed. Minute of the meeting of Perth Kinross Integration Joint Board of the 30th of November for noting. Agreed. Minute of the meeting of the Corporate Health and Safety and Wellbeing Consultative Committee of the 10th of December for noting. Agreed. Minute of the meeting of the Employees Joint Consultative Committee of the 22nd of November 18 for noting. Agreed. Minute of the meeting of the Tay Cities Region Joint Committee of the 9th of November 18 for noting. Agreed. Now move on to item 4, which is the Revenue Budget Monitoring Report, number 4, and Mr Mackenzie.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Councillors. The projected net underspend on service budgets is £3.682 million, or 1.36% of the net service expenditure, which represents a small movement from the position reported to committee in February. The main movements are highlighted in section 2 of the report and detailed in appendix 2. Proposals to utilise £3.6 million of the projected underspend in future years through budget flexibility were approved by Council in setting a revenue budget on the 20th of February. Proposed movements and reserves are detailed in section 2.4 of the report. These include adjustments to reflect the delivery of the transformation programme, affordable housing, the use of reserves to meet severance costs generating future savings, and the application of £579,000 of the Community Investment Fund to community projects as approved by the Executive Subcommittee in March. As set out in section 3 in appendix 5, the current net projected overspend on the Perth Kinross Integration Joint Board is £836,000, a movement of £221,000 from the position reported to committee in February. The housing revenue account remains at break-even, with additional expenditure on repairs and improvement being offset by a reduced revenue contribution to housing capital. Including health and social care, the total net projected underspend on the General Fund revenue budget is £3.455 million. Section 5 of the report proposes a number of adjustments to the 2019-20 revenue budget. Since the budget was approved in February, the Council has been advised of approximately £1.8 million of funding for 2019-20, including £778,000 for the extension of free personal care to the under-65s. Section 5 also sets out a number of proposed environments and transfers to and from reserves. Happy to take questions, Convener.
Okay, do we have any questions at this point? No questions? Then I'll move the paper. Sorry. Councillor Donaldson.
Yes, we've
I'm not
already
sure what
had a
that
bit
noise
of debate about this year's budget, and that will continue again at full council next Wednesday. But I'd like to ask about last year's budget. It's Appendix 2, and it's back to an old chestnut, but it is still there. It's page 63, 100,000 delay in progressing town centre management initiative, 100,000 delay in progressing small town retail facade project. And that's now 14 months on since February of last year. Can we just get an update on those two projects and what's proposed to happen with them?
Mrs Renton.
There will be a report coming to the next E&I committee on those two funds and linking it to the Scottish Government Town Centre funding.
Okay, just as a follow-up then, these two projects are under the revenue budget, whereas the Town Centre Fund, Scottish Government Town Centre Fund, is, I understand, under capital spending.
That's correct.
So you're going to link the two together. So you're going to morph these two revenue items into capital.
No, we wouldn't, not necessarily morphing them in. It's about how best to support, you know, sort of all three initiatives.
Right, but it will be an amalgam with the 1.9 million coming from the Scottish Government.
Not necessarily an amalgam, but it's about how we use all three funds collectively to make the best use of the funding that's available.
Right, so that, at least something is at last happening.
Councillor McDade.
Thank you. I just wanted a bit more information about the devolved school management budget, which is mentioned on page 42. It says projected underspend of 758,000 on DSM budgets, mainly due to staff slippage. But I think this is a budget that regularly has underspend, so I just wanted to probe that a bit more as to why schools perhaps at the end of the financial year aren't spending what's left on useful things like textbooks.
Okay, Mrs Devlin.
In relation to the underspend in the DSM budget, Councillor McDade, there is quite often money left at the end of the year that may in fact be planned carry forwards where schools are budgeting for different expenditure that might be of a more significant nature that they might make less frequently than an annual spend, and with specific reflection on the total amount here of the £758,000, which represents under 1% of the total budget across over 80 schools. So relatively speaking, it's not a huge amount of money. In relation to that total amount, £440,000 links to staff slippage, so that could just be posts that perhaps have not been filled in, within the anticipated timescales, and £220,000 actually relates to what's called supplies and services, and that may be where schools have decided that they have a larger expenditure in 1 year and will basically save up money from year to year to be able to make that kind of purchase.
Councillor Lane.
Thanks, Convener. Maybe for Mr Patterson, welcome to the chamber. If we could just get an explanation, it's on page 71, where we've got care at home, the demand is an overspend of 746, and the next line is care at home, an underspend of 516,000. There'll be a reason, but I don't understand what the two different lines mean.
So the first line reflects the fact that because of the challenges in recruiting staff to the heart team, people's stay in hospital has been delayed, and how we've addressed that is by moving people into interim care home placements while awaiting the recruitment developments that we've sought to progress. The second line reflects the fact that there's been significant slippage because of the lack of staff in those teams, and more recently we've recruited 14 staff in the last 2 or 3 weeks, so we hope to address that balance.
Okay, so, okay. Any further questions, Councillor Purvis?
Could I ask about the council tax income, please, which is on 3.1 on page 30. I'm just looking back at the last revenue monitoring report that came, and there was a reported excess budget of £300,000. I was just wondering whether, and obviously this has increased to 500,000, have those figures been incorporated, or at least the amount of money we were aware of in the previous one on the 6th of February in the assumptions for this year's budget process?
Thank you for your question, Councillor Purvis. Yes, they have been. We've adjusted for uplifts in the tax base, reflect on experience.
Okay, any further questions? No. Move the paper.
Sorry, just to be picky about procedure, did we have a seconder for that?
I'm happy to second it, although it's sort of customary that if there's unanimous agreement in the chamber to agree the paper, that's not normally required, but I'll be steered by the convener.
It is, however, the standing order position, so thank you for seconding it, Councillor Barrett.
It's always been the custom that if all councillors agree, then we move forward. But if your point, taking your point on board, we will review procedures. Okay, we move on to the next item, which is the composite capital budget, the capital investment programme for 18 to 23 in the monitoring report number 4. And could I ask Mr Mackenzie to introduce again, please?
Thank you, Convener. The gross budget for the 10-year composite programme to 2027-28 is currently estimated at approximately £661 million. This includes over £10 million of funded adjustments approved by Council in setting the capital budget on the 20th of February. And as was previously discussed, notification was also received from the Scottish Government in March of £1.983 million of ring-fence grant funding in 2019-20 in relation to the Town Centre Fund to support sustainable growth. Section 3 summarises progress to date of the composite programme. Net expenditure to the 28th of February is approximately £34.3 million. There are a number of proposed adjustments to service capital budgets, including the reinvestment of savings on school projects, the rephasing of expenditure on structural maintenance, the St Paul's Church project and the Prudential Borrowing Programme, and the acceleration of expenditure on traffic signal renewals and the Creative Exchange and Perth City Hall schemes. All of these adjustments are reflected in Appendices 1 and 2 to the report. Section 4 and Appendix 3 sets out progress of the Housing Capital Investment Programme. The budget for the 5-year programme to 2022-23 remains unchanged at approximately £58.7 million. Net expenditure on the Housing Capital Programme to the 28th of February is approximately £14 million. Proposed adjustments include the rephasing of new build projects and major adaptations, the reinvestment of savings on the garages and lock-up programme, and the early realisation of receipts. As summarised in Section 5, the projected outturn on the composite programme for 2018-19 is £50.9 million, or 72% of the budget approved in June. The outturn for the Housing Capital Programme is £17.6 million, or 127% of the budget approved in April, due to the acceleration of expenditure on the Council's new build and buyback programmes. Happy to take questions, Convener.
Okay. Any questions? Councillor Dugan.
Thanks, Convener. Having reviewed the key capital projects detailed within the report, I'm minded to ask what significant capital projects have been started under the Conservative Lib Dem administration over the last 2 years?
As far as projects actually started concerned, none.
Thanks. And if I could have one more question, Convener.
There are plans, as you are well aware.
Right. I'm looking at page, maybe for Mr Mackenzie, I'm looking at page 101 in Appendix 1, and it's the gross capital grant from Scottish Government, which is just under £27 million. I'm conscious that quite a lot of that was ring-fenced for early learning and childcare and flooding and extra things like that. However, from recollection of budget day, I think there was £2.7 million unallocated within that grant, and I think the administration spent either 1.3 or 1.4 of that, whichever it was. There was 1.3 or 1.4 million pounds of unallocated, unring-fenced capital grant from Scottish Government. Can I ask Mr Mackenzie where that is and what it's doing and how it's benefiting Perth and Kinross?
Thank you, Convener. Thank you, Councillor Dugan. I think your recollection is better than mine on this occasion. But the totality of the resources available have been applied to the capital programme over the 10 years of the capital programme, so it's funding projects as approved by Council in February.
So I think just really trying to understand the mechanics of it. If you receive that capital grant and you don't spend it, are you in effect just borrowing less and therefore making some kind of very small revenue saving? Like, it must be benefiting us in some way, surely.
Yes, it reduces our borrowing requirement because it's another source of funding.
Okay, any further questions?
It's again for Mr Mackenzie. a C note of Blairgowrie Recreation Centre and the extra money, well, not extra money, money put back in that was removed previously. But the project's been pushed back 3 or 4 years. Could Mr Mackenzie just give me what construction inflation is likely to be over the next 4 years, and that obviously the cost to pushing projects back?
Thank you, Councillor Ling. From memory, construction inflation, because as I understand it from the indices which are used by the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, construction inflation is estimated to be around 3% and increasing over the next few years. So an average of 4% over the coming period would be the figure for construction inflation as an average.
Yeah, I think it was, by my recollection, it was 3% just now, going up to 7% over the next 2 years. So if we push a project back by 4 years, we're compounding up about 19% in the cost of that project.
Take your comment. Councillor McEwen.
I would like to confirm the total cost of the Rattray Primary School upgrade project. As I don't normally see these reports, I don't fully understand the figures, how they're laid out. Just a simple question.
Can you tell me which page it's referred to in this?
That's on page 106. I think there's a page that finishes on page 112. Spreadsheet that says London House.
Okay.
Councillor McEwen, can I just check what you're actually asking for clarification of, please?
Is the full cost, capital cost of the Rattray Primary School upgrade project?
In the context of the expansion of early learning and childcare and the refurbishment works that are also being undertaken? Okay.
Councillor McEwen, the approximate budget for the Rattray upgrades around about £3.6 million. Obviously, we're still subject to going to planning in May, which, and obviously then at that point we'll be able to confirm the exact kind of costs.
Councillor Parrott.
Thank you, Convener. I'm on page 83, paragraph 2.1, with relation to the creative exchange, the first bullet point. The assumed 30-party contribution of £1 million from the Tay City deal has been removed. I'm not aware of any difficulty with the creative exchange project, so I'm assuming monies have been found from elsewhere for that. Can I ask for clarification as to how that's being done now? Thank you.
Mr. Valentine.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you, Councillor Parrott. The Tay City deal funding was previously adjusted by Council through previous reports. The project itself was unsuccessful. The creative exchange was an unsuccessful project, but the Council has accounted for that in its budget.
Okay. Councillor Donaldson.
Thank you. 2 questions. First of all, on the Town Centre Fund, 3.49, page 89, it's just to seek clarification, and that is the council officers did receive a letter from the Scottish Government, and I have to say it wasn't entirely clear. So that 1.98 million, this is quite important, does that have to relate to work that is completed by the 31st of March 2020, or can it relate to where contracts have been taken out, but the completion may be quite a bit further on? And I think that is important in terms of the type of projects that can be undertaken. Thanks.
Mr. Valentine. Stuart, Mr. Mackenzie, sorry.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you, Councillor Donaldson. We sought further clarification through COSLA from the Scottish Government on the conditions of the grant funding. So the resources can be carried forward for projects which are commenced one financial year and carry on to a subsequent financial year. The grant can also be used to enhance existing projects which are currently under consideration.
Just say that's good news, and that gives significant more leeway and flexibility. I'm not going to pursue on that. That's good. Second point is on the vehicle replacement programme, again on page 89, and we've got here a proposed movement of 883,000 from the last financial year to 2019-2020, and it's also repeated on page 93. Can I ask, does that reflect on vehicle replacement programme? And I'm thinking of our own budget proposals in February of this year. Does this reflect a policy shift, or is it just a one-off item?
It's actually a reflection of the market. We ordered, sort of a number of, sort of vehicles early in the financial year last year, and at least 2 of them have not been delivered, sort of just because of the demand. So it's actually a reflection of we've ordered it, but we haven't received them yet.
Okay, so it's event specific, so there's still possibilities for change and policy on that front. Thank you.
I'm not sure what your last comment said. There's still, for a change of policy, if the vehicles have been ordered.
No, because I think you saw in our budget proposals that we did put forward specific measures on vehicle replacement policy. So I was trying to find out if it was a shift in policy or if it was event specific. So I've had my question answered. Thank you.
Thank you. My question is on Appendix 2. It's in relation to Pitlochry High School. Community is very pleased to see the upgrade works that are being undertaken at the moment as part of a long-planned improvement of parts of the secondary building. My question is the entirety of the original planned budget, which is in this budget here that we're looking at, it's still to be spent on the high school part of the building, or is it going to be spent on other parts of the building as well?
Mr. Boland.
Councillor McDade, I could probably just confirm, obviously, the assessment of the site is ongoing and the money will be spent as appropriate throughout the site.
Okay. Any further questions? No, thank you. Excuse me. On the continued excellent progress towards the delivery of our capital budget, officers across the council continue to roll out significant levels of capital investment in our assets and infrastructure. The Head of Finance provided elected members with an overview of the report. The update of the capital budget incorporates the decisions of the council on the 20th of February 19, including £400,000 for the Blair Recreation Centre, £1 million for the schools' road safety measures, and £5.2 million for the Perth City bridges that are vital to our future infrastructure. As the capital budget progresses, I look forward to providing further updates on the huge levels of investment across Perth and Kinross by both council and the Tay-Cities deal, our partners. Can I move the paper?
Yeah, in seconding that, convener, can I briefly say that it's really good to see that the works to St Paul's Church are progressing according to plan, and to hear reports of positive feedback from local businesses on that subject. The report also highlights the substantial housing revenue account investment programme totalling almost 59 million, and including the start of phase 2 of the new council house builds at Lynn Road, Stanley, and progress with the former Glebe School site in Scone. The HRA net expenditure outturn is 127% of budget, and the actual spend is up from 2018-19 in percentage terms. So I'm happy to second. Thank you.
Any amendments? No. We'll move on. Introduce the item for us, please. Brenda, Mrs. Lang.
The report and the associated appendix provides the 4th annual report on the proposed programme and priorities for preparation of the supplementary guidance to support the local development plan. It updates on the progress that's been made in relation to the priorities set in last year's annual report, and proposes a programme which will achieve readiness of the guidance for adoption following adoption of LDP2 later this year. Some of the guidance is already in place in association with our current LDP. However, the legislation requires that we reconsult on all the guidance in association with the next plan. And that kind of sits regardless of whether we're making any significant changes to the documents. The table at paragraph 2.2 of the report lists the statutory guidance, sets out the timetable for consulting on the draft documents. Whilst previously we've intimated that we would try and consult on all the documents at once, we've had feedback suggesting it's too much for communities and community councils to deal with at the one time. So we have decided that, or we're proposing that it be done in stages. The report proposes holding briefing sessions for elected members where there are significant changes to guidance, where it's a rollover. We wouldn't see that as being as important, but we would provide a paper briefing. And those briefings would be in advance of us going out to public consultation. It's also requested that authority to approve minor changes to the non-statutory guidance is delegated to the Executive Director of Housing and Environment.
Thanks very much. Any questions? Councillor Lane?
You're very perceptive, Convener. Thank you. I'm glad to see the part about developer contributions and affordable housing that came from a report of the Scrutiny Committee. And I see that before this goes out to consultation, draft guidance is going to be coming to this committee. Could I ask officers if it also comes back to the Scrutiny Committee to look at it as well before it goes out, as the Scrutiny Committee had about 3 or 4 sessions on this very topic?
Yeah. That's something that's agreeable, yeah?
I think that could be done, yeah, no problem.
Okay. Councillor McCall.
Thank you, Convener. Hello. You mentioned there briefly that you've had some engagement back from community councils regarding sensible times and engagement with them. I'm just wondering if you give me an indication of how many community councils are getting in touch with you and what the general consensus is. Are people engaging with the process? Because I know you've been doing a lot of work on placemaking currently, and I'm just wanting to get an indication of how the community is being encouraged to engage in this.
Yeah, I would have to say it very much depends on the nature and content of the guidance. Some of it can be quite technical. In the last round of consultation, we consulted on flooding guidance, which too technical really for members of the general public. So another one was housing in the countryside. Lots of comment back on that, and it's across all kind of sections of the community. So lots of interest there. Yeah.
Are we getting a broad range of all the community councils really across the area actually engaging in the process?
No.
It's limited, I would have to say, in terms of the community councils, yes. And the specific request for less guidance coming out at once really came from Fossaway Community Council. So,
thank you very much.
Councillor McDade.
Thank you, Convener. My question is around the forest and woodland strategy. It says you're awaiting input from Forestry Commission Scotland on the extent of changes required, and consultation on the guidance will take place in September 2019. Obviously, it's now Forest and Land Scotland, but I'm wondering if the change of organisation is causing any delays in that, and whether that's likely to impact the timeline, push it back from September.
No, we have had a recent meeting with Forestry Commission, and basically they have said that they don't expect there to be a lot of requirements for changes from their point of view, so September should be fine for that consultation.
Councillor Parrott.
Thank you, Convener. I'm on page 121 on the bullet regarding airfield safeguarding. Can you clarify quickly just what is the general thrust of that statutory guidance? What are we required to do to safeguard airfields, and how does it affect us here?
I'm not really briefed in the full detail of that piece of guidance. In terms of the changes proposed to that, they are very limited. I think we've just put out a briefing paper to yourselves in relation to potential changes and the inclusion of an additional airfield in that. I don't have information just now in relation to exact detail of the full guidance.
But we will come back to you on that, Councillor Parrott.
Councillor Donaldson.
Thank you. Page 133, conservation area appraisals, and that matters because the potential exists for funding from external sources. There was a whole raft of appraisals done about 10 years ago, and they're actually exceptionally useful documents, and I think quite a lot of councillors don't know about them. But do we, and I'm conscious of capacity issues, but do we have a schedule for the updating of these appraisals?
We did look, and we have reviewed one or two of them in the past, and we're currently looking at we're looking at the appraisal for Burnham. And again, that was a resources issue. In terms of a programme moving forward, we haven't put that together yet, and that will be dependent on when resources become available. We are potentially, it has fallen to our development management colleagues to undertake that work. My team, the local development plan team, are keen to assist in the progression of those, but we've yet to have that internal discussion as to whether across the teams we would have the capacity to move that forward.
Can I just put in one quick supplementary? I do think, and this is local, but with Comrie that does matter because of the magnitude of the flood prevention scheme. I also noticed there are two, it seems to me, omissions. One, and it wasn't covered in the first round of appraisals, but is Otterada. And the other one, is surprisingly, is from your list, is Crieff, which I'd have thought is an area that should be covered. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Convener. I just, having reviewed all the sort of the measures that are up for review, wonder that when they're all reconciled, what sort of impact that will have on the, I hesitate to say expediency, but certainly the ease with which responsible, sustainable and desirable developments will go from the sort of the idea phase to actually delivery, because we've seen some tremendous increases in development in and around Perth, the like of which it's hard to remember, and it's, some of us wish to see that type of pace and delivery continue. Is this going to assist with that in any meaningful way?
Yeah, I mean, across the piece of the supplementary guidance, it is there to provide further information to support the policy framework and give additional guidance to developers when they're bringing forward applications. So, yes, by its nature, it should help in that process and save a lot of time where developers may come to development management during the application process with queries. So it does, reduce the time involved there. I think one of the other things that and one of the key things we're hoping to achieve, particularly through the placemaking guide, is a better standard of development from the outset, which again should speed up the planning application process. I think we have recently held, as part of our consultation exercise, an event with agencies, developers, who submit applications frequently to the council, held an event with them, trying to get buy-in, if you like, to the principles of placemaking, looking at some of the technical notes that we've prepared to support the guidance around housing in the countryside and infill developments, various types of specifics. So that seemed to be generally well accepted, and I think our next stage in trying to disseminate the guidance will be to have a session with the members of the council and work through the same types of things that we'd be doing with applicants and agents, and just to push forward that place-making agenda so that we're all hopefully singing from the same hymn sheet.
Okay, a supplementary, convener, if I can. Just to seek further reassurance on how we would intelligently reconcile our housing in the countryside policy and the appropriate limitations and constraints that may apply to development to an area of Scotland which is largely countryside and has a housing shortage. So the two things are competing, so we need to manage them carefully in terms of reconciliation. So how will this help with that?
The guidance that's being produced, well, we have guidance in terms of housing in the countryside, which supports the policy. So it's really the actual, the policy thrust that would require to be changed. We're obviously in a position where that policy has been commented on through the LDP review. The supplementary guidance itself just helps to better interpret that. So there are some points of clarification which will come through that, which we may gain increased consistency on through the review of the guidance. But in terms of a significant change or alluding to a much larger number of houses coming through that avenue, that wouldn't be the case.
And just finally, convener, if I can, it's a specific point on page 134 where there's a list of developments. It's just to double check that these are a mixture of commercial and residential developments on that left-hand box on the bottom of page 134. Are they a mixture of residential and commercial?
Yes, they are.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
It was just to clarify a point in relation to Councillor Laing's question. So Councillor Laing's question, as far as I understood it, was in his role as convener of the Scrutiny Committee, asking if some of the supplementary guidance could go to scrutiny. But part of the question that he asked was, or the way that he phrased it was, that the draft supplementary guidance would be coming to committee prior to going out to consultation. Now, my understanding is that the draft supplementary guidance goes out to consultation. It wasn't coming to committee prior, but you did in your introduction, Mrs. Murray, explain that there would be sessions for members, workshop type sessions or presentations where it would be explained to us before it went out to consultation, but it's not a question of it coming to committee prior to consultation.
No, in general, kind of relates back to a historic decision was taken that to speed up the process of producing the guidance, we wouldn't report to committee prior to going out to consultation. It is accepted that there will be some pieces of guidance where further or where committee involvement may be necessary prior to publication of that document for consultation. So there will be instances where that happens, but the norm would be we would have a briefing session with members, so there would be an opportunity to input and changes taken on board, and then we would go out to consultation and report back with comments and findings.
Further point of clarification from Councillor
Convener, I
Laing.
was quoting from page 121 where it says it is considered appropriate to report the revised draft guidance to this committee before going out to consultation.
And that's specific to the developer contributions, and that is one that we have thought was significant enough to take that process.
And to Councillor Stewart, that was the part I was asking to come to scrutiny as well.
That's fine.
For the proposed programme of priorities for preparing supplementary guidance to support the local development plan review process currently underway. It provides an update in respect of the progress made on the preparation of statutory supplementary guidance and non-statutory guidance work programmes. It is noted that good progress has been made to date and that the consultation has already taken place with various pieces of guidance, with further consultations programmed for May through to September. Implementation of the priorities set out in the programme will ensure that the planning policy framework is in place to support Local Development Plan 2. Can I have a seconder?
Formally second.
Thank you.
Can I have a comment?
Comments?
Yeah, it shows how the pressure our staff in the planning department are, because I'm concerned to see that there's 20 areas where we're looking for conservation area appraisals, where we don't have anybody to do it, and the only one that we're undertaking is at Burnham, in my ward, and it has been put on hold due to lack of resources. So that's a total of 21, and there's no target, there's nothing to be updated, and so it's just to point out that we must be looking to increase
thank you
staff.
for your comment, and I'm sure Mr. Marshall and Mrs. Murray will update you after the meeting. Comment, Councillor Donaldson.
Yes, can I just echo Councillor Lane's remarks? We do need a schedule for these appraisals. They are immensely useful documents for local members. I think they can help greatly in planning decisions, and it is something I think we need to give greater urgency to.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments? No, thank you. We'll move on.
Thank you, Convener. Councillors, can you hear me? Great. Councillors, you have two options to decide from this morning. Following the review that we've carried out of our cultural trusts, Horsecross Arts and Culture Perth and Kinross, this report follows two reports which have been to this committee already, one in June 2018 asking you to approve the scope of the review, and one in September 2018 giving you an update on the progress with the review. Your options are for Culture Perth and Kinross and Horsecross to continue as two separate culture trusts, or to approve work for us to move towards a single culture trust with an estimated go-live date of October 2020. If you decide on the latter, there is 12 months detailed work ahead of us. First of all, there's a priority to move Horsecross to a sustainable financial footing, and paragraph 2.6 in the report sets out the current position with Horsecross Arts. And we need to make rapid improvements in partnership with Horsecross colleagues in how it currently operates. But alongside that, there is detailed work to do on the operating model for a single trust, if that's what you decide you would like to do, and the one-off setup costs of that new organisation. But worth saying that work is required anyway on the operating model for 5 new major attractions in Perth City Centre, with a particular focus on City Hall, and the business case that we're in the process of preparing for UK Government and Scottish Government to demonstrate we can run City Hall as a project which is expected to have UK and international profile. Now, a huge amount of data and evidence was examined as part of the review team over a 4-month period last year, and a lot of consideration to design the options appraisal criteria. And I'm grateful, if I can just take an opportunity to thank the chief executives of both trusts, Helen Smout and Mike Griffiths, who contributed fully in both those tasks, the design of the criteria and the scoring exercise which followed. Appendix 1 sets out the proceeds of that and more detail of how we carried out the options appraisal. Now, if you do decide on a single cultural trust, change will not happen overnight, and whichever option you decide on, success depends on the will and ambition of everyone, ALIOs and officers in the council, to put audiences and customers at the heart of the work we need to do, rather than focus on existing structures and ways of working. In terms of creating a single organisation, there are examples which are not so good of single public bodies which have been set up, and there are also some good examples of where that's happened. I'm happy to take questions on the report, councillors.
Councillor Donaldson.
Thank you. First of all, many of us here have deep concerns on this front, but under observations, what we intend to do from our group is to move an amendment. It's a very simple amendment, and that will be to delete section 3 of 3.5, but we'll come to that in a minute. I think there are a number of questions that have to be asked. Can I ask, first of all, under the table 2 on revenue sources for culture in addition to council contract fees, we don't mention a number of external funding sources. Clearly, the Ganachie Trust and clearly the likes of Robertson Trust. Can I just ask, why is that? Have you decided just to show purely recurring sources of revenue?
Thank you for the question. Is this working? Yes. Is this working? Good.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question, Councillor Donaldson. The reason why we didn't include those sources of revenue, as the report mentions, is because they're not guaranteed annual sources of revenue. They depend on one-off applications to the Ganachie Trust, the Robertson Trust, other trusts and foundations. What we tried to do in Table 2 was set out core sources of revenue that help to swell the funding for both the current ALIOs. Similarly, we set out separately in the report how commercial income is raised by both trusts.
Thank you. I now ask the Chief Executive wants to pass a comment. So I'll ask Chief Executive now.
Thank you, Convener. Councillors, I have on a number of occasions now met with the Chair of Horsecross. I'd like to draw your attention, please, to section 2.6 of the report and update you on a matter. If I draw your attention specifically to the third sentence in that paragraph that commences improvements in governance, etc., we have indeed, as the advisory group, agreed to work in partnership with the Horsecross board to support improvements that are required. However, we as a council would always reserve the right to a more radical intervention should we not be able to see the necessary collective improvements. Some of the improvements that we are looking at are working together to establish a cultural vision, looking at marketing, fundraising and indeed catering facilities within Horsecross, developing the cultural programme to ensure complementarity both within Perth and Kinross and across the wider Tay-Cities partnership, improving communications with Horsecross and indeed supporting Horsecross to have a more diverse board and achieve better governance.
Thank you very much. I believe it's Councillor Sheila McCall.
Thank you, Convener. I have a couple of questions, if I may. The first question is on page 141 on the second bullet point and indeed the third. The second bullet point states that external funding has been regularly raised, but suggests that a joined-up approach is more likely to be credible to funders. I'm just wondering what evidence there is for that statement and whether or not there is any restrictions in the current setup of the two separate organisations to prevent a joined-up approach where it's appropriate.
Thank you for the question, Councillor McCall. The point was raised a number of times during the review, or the question was raised, I should say, about whether a single culture trust would be less successful in attracting funding, for the reason that I think you're alluding to in your question. This was an assertion that was made at several points during the review. There is no evidence to support the argument which says that a single culture trust would be less successful in attracting funding from major funders like Heritage Lottery Fund, the Ganachie, and so on. We looked at evidence from organisations like Glasgow Life, which has a number of different arms operating different kinds of services and applies very successfully to the same sources of funding for grants to deliver different types of activities.
Thank you. I don't really understand the answer, to be perfectly honest, in relation to the question that I asked. I asked whether or not a joined-up approach is more likely to be credible. I'm asking what is the evidence from the current funders that a joined-up approach is likely to be more credible for our cultural trusts and for our Horse Cross Trust.
Apologies, Councillor McCall. I think the evidence can be found in the funding criteria for most significant funders. I've worked at a senior level in arts administration and policy for about 20 years. So, for example, if you look at the funding criteria for any of the given Heritage Lottery fund grants and others, you will see inevitably Creative Scotland, another example, that evidence is asked for ability to demonstrate partnership, ability to demonstrate strong collaboration, ability to demonstrate there's no additionality, in other words, no duplication, and ability to demonstrate value add to activities that may be going on within a given locality. So to give you an example of that, I'm asked to comment on funding applications from Horse Cross Arts and other arts organisations in Perth and Kinross who apply to Creative Scotland for funding. And in all cases, I'm asked to comment on those issues around partnership and collaboration. So it is an important criteria that most funders take into account.
Thank you. And just to the second part of my question, is there anything to restrict or prohibit the existing cultural trusts from collaborating where appropriate to apply for funding from the same funding source?
No, Councillor McCall, there's nothing to restrict them from doing that. There has been quite limited examples of that happening to date, but there has been more work done recently on that. So this is an example which doesn't relate to the Alios, but Pitlochry Festival Theatre, Burnham Arts and Horse Cross have recently secured funding for new writing, new playwriting, which will be developed and delivered in Highland, Perthshire. So it can be done.
Thank you. And just a quick supplementary. So just to be clear, there doesn't need to be a single cultural trust for two separate trusts to apply jointly for funding from a single source?
No, there doesn't, but there is no evidence to suggest that a single culture trust would in any way diminish chances of securing significant external funding for Perth and Kinross and the arts in Perth and Kinross.
Councillor McDade.
Thank you, Convener. The Chief Executive's answered my first question already, so thank you for that. I have another two questions. The first one is in the report at 2.5, it talks about library usage and changing library patterns and the potential need for rationalisation, I think is the indication there, of libraries. My question is, will that rationalisation, were it to happen, be dictated by statistical empirical evidence? For example, the use of Pitlochry Library, when it was reported in the 1st of November at Lifelong Learning in 2017, the use of Pitlochry Library was up 9% and the use of AK Bell was up 5.93%, which would suggest these communities are using these libraries more than previously. So to me that would not make sense to close those libraries, but if the ones where they're being not having such good usage. So that's my first question. Would that be based on, as it were, statistical evidence? And my second question, I don't know if you want to take them separately, but second question then is, it talks about under other findings that you've got that there is an opportunity to do joined up work, sharing costs, etc. with Pitlochry Festival Theatre, Dundee Rep, etc. to share risk. However, I think there might be more value potentially in partnering, for example, with a similar sized regional theatre elsewhere in the country where you won't be competing for the same market, where you can have that risk sharing, etc., but you won't actually be competing for the same market, and actually may do better out of that, although I do think the PFT model, where it does significant amounts of in-house production, is very successful, as demonstrated by the fact they have one of the lowest levels of public subsidy in the country.
Thank you for the questions, Councillor McDade. Both of them require more detailed answers than I think I've got time to give, but happy to speak to you after this if there's anything you want to follow up on. On the libraries question, first of all, the answer is yes. We've reviewed libraries and patterns of use in the past before, and we have made changes to services in the past. We do rely on data and evidence to inform recommendations to councillors about any changes to the service. One of the many advantages of a free statutory library service is that actually we have a lot of data about how customers use libraries, what books they borrow and from where, when they use libraries, and we've made changes in the past, for example, to reflect the fact that more people work shifts, and therefore going to a library in the evening is easier for them than going in the daytime, for example. In terms of your broader question about library patterns of use and how they're changing, I think just briefly to say that there are probably two different things at play here. One is how library use happens in Perth and Kinross, and you're absolutely right, usage of Pitlochry has gone up in recent years. There is a very dedicated member of staff there who is, respected and valued by the community, and the people in the libraries are a significant asset. Equally, we've seen footfall go down in other small rural libraries that we are responsible for. At a UK level, I would say, this is a big moot point about whether libraries are declining, but it's certainly true to say that people are using libraries for different things, and we've seen that in our own libraries. So a huge shift to online use, and footfall is changing. People are tending to come in for other reasons than just borrowing books. Does that answer your point on that before I move on to...
But just the second one around the collaboration perhaps with another theatre further afield,
yes,
so we're not competing with the same markets.
So, again, a couple of things here that are probably worth pointing out. You made the point about whether it makes sense, in fact, for Pitlochry, Dundee Rep and Perth Theatre to collaborate formally when, in fact, they're competing for the same audiences. I would say, and it's a bit like the arguments presented for a single culture trust, that is the case anyway. They are all competing for the same audiences. So 80% of Perth Theatre's current audiences come from Perth and Kinross, or a 30-minute drive time, certainly, of the theatre. There is strong evidence, therefore, which suggests it would be better for these amazing venues to be collaborating on programming and making sure that they're not duplicating their offer, and that there's a stronger, more cohesive offer with different aspects to it, delivered from those three venues and potentially others. In terms of your point about collaboration with other UK venues, you're absolutely right, Councillor McDade, and that does actually happen with all three of those theatres. So Pitlochry Festival Theatre, as you may be aware, are pursuing co-productions with theatres in England. Horsecross Arts have collaborated with theatres in Ireland in the past, and so on. But really it comes down to understanding your audience, where they're coming from, and making sure that venues that are located in quite a small geographic area are not competing for the same audiences. And Perth and Kinross is the only local authority area outside of Dundee and outside of Glasgow and Edinburgh, which has two producing theatres on its patch. Now that is a great asset, but it's also a challenge.
Thank you. Councillor Forbes.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I've got a couple of questions, if you'll indulge me. I'm on page 138, paragraph 1.6, and it's regarding the Barclay Review. seems to have capped the rates relief for Perth Kinross at 600,000. So my first question is, can I get an explanation of where that comes from and how that £600,000 has been arrived at? And if it's okay, I've got a second question after this.
Stuart Mackenzie will take that question. Councillor Forbes.
Thanks, Convener, and thank you, Councillor Forbes. Effectively, the Scottish Government drew a line in the sand at a point in November and said that the level of discretionary rates relief being granted by a local authority at that point would act as a benchmark going forward. So effectively, we have a value in terms of discretionary rates relief. The composition of the properties involved in that can change, but the value won't. It will be uplifted by the exchange rate poundage, but the absolute value won't.
Thank you for that. And my second question, I was looking to see how much this would actually cost us, because in 1.7 it says it's explained in para 2.4. So I went to 2.4 to find it wasn't there. It is actually in 2.5, but I found 2.4 quite interesting, and I'm absolutely happy to accept I may be missing something here. But the second line says ALIOs were asked to provide specific quantifiable evidence. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I think the sixth line says that ALIO's response was not specific or quantifiable. Could we not have asked them to revisit that and give us the specific and quantifiable evidence we'd asked for?
Thank you for the question, Councillor Forbes. We asked, just as a bit of background, we asked the ALIOs to provide the evidence, really the case for status quo, because we thought that that was pretty important, so that we were considering not just the benefits of change, but also the benefits of leaving things as they are, recognising that change is always a given, whatever structures you're managing. The ALIO chief executives were given just under a month to provide that evidence for us, and we got a very detailed document from them in response, 27 pages long, in fact. But as I've briefly summarised in the report, the evidence that they provided was not specific enough or quantifiable enough, and there were questions about some of the evidence. So to give you an example of that, the ALIO chief executives, as part of their case against option 2, if you like, rather than their case for option 1, suggested that we might need to spend an additional £100,000 a year on administering payroll, which we had some questions about. We did go back, to come to your question, we did go back to the ALIOs and ask them if they wanted to expand, change or add to the evidence that they had provided, but we didn't receive a response to that.
Councillor Purvis.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions. The first one is to follow up on Councillor Forbes' question about rates relief. We had discussions at, I think, more than one previous SPNR committee about this. Mr Mackenzie, you talked about that the composition could change, although the 600,000 figure was fixed. Does that also apply to the ALIOs as well? I know that I looked at the legal advice in I think the third appendix. The model, if we were going to merge it, would be that one would continue on and the other would be subsumed into that. So just to check, would that 600,000 apply to, well, one, any other ALIOs we ever set up in the future, but specifically if we were to merge the two?
Thank you, Councillor Purvis, for your question. My colleague, Mr Simpson, will keep me correct here in my understanding of the legislation. But effectively, the figure was drawn up from a list of existing properties of a council was granting rates relief at a point in time. And then, as I say, that will be uplift. So the figure of £600,000 will change over time, but only by the increase in rates poundage. But the properties which are granted relief can change. So properties could come in and properties which could fall out, depending on what structures the council and indeed ALIOs take in the future. But the value won't change. The levels and the limits on rates relief won't change.
I think my question specifically was about the composition of the ALIOs rather than the buildings, whether that has any bearing. No. Okay. And I suppose just a quick supplementary to that one, the comments made about the City Hall not being eligible, that's just in relation to whether or not, because the project was started before the review, we thought perhaps maybe we might have been eligible for relief. Say, for example, if some buildings we were no longer needing that were in the current composition, that the City Hall could, if I'm right, use the part of the allocation for rates relief. Is that correct? And my last question is just generally about the timescales. I'm very supportive of the proposals to merge the trust. I think we shouldn't see it as a panacea. There are some governance issues and other issues that will have to be dealt with regardless of what we decide to do. I just wanted to ask, given that we've been talking about this since 2015, at that time we decided that it was too difficult to do, and that's what we came about with Sculpture Perth Kinross was set up. I'm just slightly concerned that we are, again, I know there has to be a business case and there has to be due process that's followed. I just had assumed that we would have been getting to this stage when we had the outcome of the review where we would have been taking a final decision rather than pushing it back even further. So I suppose, first, why is it taking so long to do it? And secondly, can we have assurance that the timescales that are set out, should the committee agree to the merger today, will they be met?
Thank you for the question, Councillor Purvis. In terms of why has it taken so long to reach this point, I think as the report makes clear, I hope, we do all reviews impartially and objectively as objectively as we can. And when you're talking about significant business change which affects people, that can be pretty challenging for some of the parties concerned. With this review, as the report says, when we carried out the options appraisal, the scoring resulted in a situation where the single culture trust actually did emerge as the highest score, but only marginally. When you look at the scoring that we attached to each of the trusts, you can see, for example, in Appendix 1 that the single culture trust scored higher than the status quo on ability to serve the needs of customers in the future. But it scored, as you would expect, quite low in terms of acceptability to the current ALIO boards and staff. So in this situation, we felt it was right to put both options in front of you so that you could make a decision based on as full a stretch of evidence as possible. In terms of timescales, a lot of the background work, as you have hopefully seen, has been done on this. I always think when you are managing a business change, particularly bringing two organisations together, and I don't myself really like the term merger because it is about trying to create something that's bigger than the sum of its parts, as it were. You need to do that as fast as you can and as slow as you must. In this case, we have City Hall opening in 2021. It will be really important, whatever you decide to do this morning, that we've got the right delivery structure in place to manage that and the other venues that we have in the city centre. Can it be achieved by October 2020 based on my experience and that of my colleagues? Yes.
Donaldson.
I only asked one question earlier. I have one other one before we move to the observations. Can I just say that option 1 does not mean the status quo, and I think that's a very important point to make. But I want to ask on the financials. We have a meeting this afternoon of Scrutiny Committee. There's a meeting of the Audit Committee on the 23rd of May, and I would just remind folk that that committee isn't just about processes and controls. The Accounts Commission report last week on the 11th of April is very clear. It does have to look at the financial strength and the risks associated with ALIOs. So the question I want to ask is quite clear. That is, with this paper, it's not so much what it says, and I appreciate the Chief Executive's update, it's rather what it doesn't say. I would like to ask, in particular with Horsecross, when we can expect to have at least a provisional set of report and accounts for the position to end of March 2019.
Thank you for the question, Councillor Donaldson. Horsecross Arts have been asked to get us their final year-end accounts by the end of this week.
they are to file their accounts when by?
Oh, sorry. You talk about filing their final accounts for 2018-19, Councillor
Yes.
Donaldson. They will do that within the overall, apologies, I misunderstood, within the wider timescale that the council has for preparing its draft accounts, because the ALIOs are treated as part of our consolidated accounts. So they will be asked to do that work in June. However, we have asked them to provide their provisional year-end figures by the end of this week.
And that will be for both Horsecross as well as Culture PKC.
The June deadline applies to CPK. We are keen to get a better understanding of the year-end position for Horsecross by the end of this week. We are clear on the projected outturn for Culture Perth and Kinross.
So for Audit Committee, there's a reasonable chance we should have more in the way of financial data for our meeting in May.
Subject to Horsecross being able to produce that, yes.
Because I think that's the one of the biggest concerns with this whole paper. We really just do not know the position on Horsecross. But anyway, we shall move to observation.
Councillor Lane first, I think it was, sorry. And then
Thank you. It's just for clarity here. We're talking about merger and everything, but I'm looking at what the committee is asked to do. And 4.3 is to direct officers to complete a full business case and timeline for a single delivery model for further consideration by the council. So I don't think, as has been quoted before, this is the final decision on this moving forward. Is my understanding correct?
Yes, Councillor Lane.
yeah. So my understanding is that this will come back to committee.
So this is just really to give officers the permission to look at it further and to bring it back to us in 2020, April 2020, I think it is. And then we will probably have a more clear understanding of where the constituent parts, the ALIOs, are financially, etc.
The short answer to that is yes.
That was my understanding.
Yep. Councillor Sheila McCall.
Thank you, Convener. On page 147, we have the scoring criteria for the options appraisal, and on page 148, we have the outcomes of that scoring criteria. I think this is a subject I've raised before about the opaqueness on how options appraisals, the strategy for those, and in fact how the scoring will be applied is presented to members. I have to be perfectly honest, if I was to try and answer questions from members of the public on how some of these outcomes were achieved, I would be at a loss to do so. But I have some very basic questions. In terms of the actual scores themselves, are these blended scores, and how many officers were on the evaluation panel?
We're still on questions. Yes, yeah, okay. Thank you for the question, Councillor McCall. As you may remember, we did, because you have raised this point before, and it was an area of focus for the committee when we submitted an update report in September last year. So we ran a further briefing session for councillors on the 24th of September, where we went through in some detail how the criteria had been designed and how the scoring was applied and what weighting was attached to each of the criteria. In terms of who developed and designed the criteria, they were developed by the full project team. So that was council officers plus the two chief executives, as I mentioned in my introduction, from Culture Perth and Kinross and Horsecross Arts. On the scoring that's presented in Appendix 1, that is a consolidated aggregated score. So what we asked each team member to do was to score individually. First of all, we then had two externally facilitated sessions to reach the consolidated score, which is in front of you.
One brief supplementary, if I may. In terms of the scoring scale, did any of the criteria achieve 83% or 100%? Because in my experience in other aspects of public sector, any organisation that adds some value usually adds some cost. And I would be very interested to know how that was taken into account.
Thank you for the question, Councillor McCall. The scale of scoring was one that we actually took advice on from our procurement and finance colleagues, so that was helpful to us. In terms of whether any of the individual criteria scored 100% or 83%, I'll need to check that and get back to you. Okay.
Thank you, Convener. Just a couple of questions. Just in terms of the recommendations in 3.5, on the second recommendation about the commissioning an independent business assessment, can I just check if there is what the potential cost of such commissioning such a piece of work would be, and if there's a budget heading it would come out of. And then another question on the fourth one, but I'll let you answer that first.
Thank you for the question, Councillor Stewart. I don't think that is a big or complex piece of work. What it is really about is, and this has been discussed at this committee before and also at scrutiny, is a thorough review of the different spaces, particularly in Perth Theatre and Perth Concert Hall, where essentially you've got two large spaces, the main auditoriums in both, and two small spaces, so the Studio Theatre in Perth Theatre and the Norrie Miller Studio in the Concert Hall, and attached to both as well you've got cafes, meeting rooms and so on. Our view in the council is that we probably need to take a more thorough look at how those are utilised to make sure that they're being used as effectively as possible to generate income, both commercial income and charitable income for those buildings, and also to look at the operating model for the catering offer in both establishments and to look at the pricing policy. So I don't envisage that is a major piece of work, but our view is it would be helpful for Horse Cross if it were undertaken externally rather than internally. Off the top of my head, I wouldn't expect that piece of work to cost more than £4,000 or £5,000, but that is an estimate.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of the fourth part of the 3.5, when you were giving us your introduction, Mrs. Robertson, you said that option 2 would lead to a potential coming together of the newer, bigger organisation, if that were the decision of the committee, in the latter half of 2020, sort of, I think you said September. If the decision were taken in only in April by this committee, 2020, is that sufficient time for that? Is that sufficient? Does that provide sufficient lead-in time for your projected end point timeline?
Thank you for the question. I believe so, because the work that we need to do between now and then, when the report talks about preparing a full business case, that also includes what the operating model, in other words, the staff structure and costs of change where these apply will, largely pertain to staffing, because we're looking at an organisation with a single chief executive, a single management team, and combined functions in terms of box office, catering, front of house, etc. The reason why we've not been able to do that detailed piece of work just now, up until now, is because we need to look in a lot of detail at the current structures and consider what that means for individuals and post holders within the current organisations. The other piece of work that we will do over the next 12 months is also looking at systems integration. So both Culture Perth and Kinross and Horse Cross Arts have got large IT systems supporting what they deliver, moving, thousands of books around libraries and booking tickets for the theatre and the concert hall. And again, what we need to do before April next year is look at where those systems can sensibly be integrated with minimal risk and minimal cost.
Thank you.
Yes.
Formally second that.
Okay. As I indicated earlier, we wish to move an amendment. It's a very clear, simple amendment. It's not too complicated. And that's under 3.5. We accept points 1, 2, and 4, but we argue for the deletion of point 3. I think we've explored a lot of the, and Councillor McCool is going to second our amendment. I think we've covered a lot of ground today. I'm still not convinced on some of the arguments that have been put forward. The question of external funding, I think, is a question of major concern. I think the remarks by Councillor McColl about the options appraisal and how that is done, I think is entirely chime with my own views. I think there's also real dangers in the fact that one trust that is specifically set up for museums and libraries and art galleries is carrying out quite distinctive functions from the trust that looks at the performing arts. There's also the whole issue of clearly, and there's much more information we need to obtain on exactly what is happening with Horsecross. And hopefully that's going to come out in the near future. We need to know greater certainty. I think for those in Culture, Perth and Kinross, who in my view have done a quite excellent job, you know, there's questions here, as applied in 2015, of staff morale as well, and what are they heading into. We've gone round the houses on this. There's a report in June 2018, then another one in September 2018, now another one now, and we now have another one, but it basically is presupposing with option 3 that we will go for a single cultural trust, and that, but although that's been kicked out to 2020. I stress again that option 1, to retain the 2 distinctive trusts, is not, in fact, the status quo. There is quite clearly scope for collaboration between the trusts and between trusts and organisations at a regional level. I think to commit ourselves right now to quite clearly a single trust, I think the other question arises in my mind, because we have been told that the business case will require detailed work. There may be capacity issues here, but it will require a lot of detailed work. It just seems to me with the City Hall, with PMAG, in particular, and we often forget the collection store because there is a flood risk with the current arrangements. That should be the key focus for our team over the next year to 2 years. And then perhaps beyond that, you can look at the case afresh. I think we right now are committing ourselves to, I think it's an unfortunate course of action. I think actually the two trusts remaining as distinctive entities, but still very much cooperating and working together, certainly for the moment is, to my mind, the best approach. And I would argue for this amendment to delete section 3.
Councillor McCall, seconding.
Yes, Convener, thank you. And if I may just make a couple of comments in support of that. I think that option 2, to direct officers to commission independent business assessment of Perth City Centre cultural venues and proposed operating model, can be absolutely carried out and will perhaps address some of the efficiency considerations that have been cited as justification for a closer look at a single trust. We've already established through the questioning process that there's nothing to prevent the individual ALIOs from collaborating, and perhaps we'd be better served in promoting that rather than trying to merge the two trusts together. I also think that while Horsecross, and I've stated this before at this committee, while Horsecross is in a precarious situation financially and operationally, that the focus really should be on making that a succinct working model, and to combine that with something that is much more successful and stable would in fact risk instability to both. And I think my final point really is around the evaluation itself. I asked some questions earlier on about funders and about what evidence there was to suggest that funders would see a single trust as being more credible, yet the evaluation criteria for that particular section doesn't bear that out. And in fact, the funders and acceptability of a single of the existing model is scored far more highly to funders than it is to a single model. And I think the funders for the cultural trusts, both of them, are extremely important, and their views and their acceptability, I think, needs to be a significant consideration. So I therefore think we're preemptive. I think there's a distinct whiff of perhaps a predetermined outcome here that that has been pursued, certainly since I've been an elected member. And I think we should take it off the table for now and make sure that what we have is working well and efficiently before we start trying to fix a problem without really evaluating everything else first.
Thank you very much for your comments. I would just make one comment to what you've said, Councillor McCall, in that the Board of Horsecross are very much aware of their financial situation and have a plan and have already implemented that plan and are taking remedial action. We have a motion and we have an amendment, so we will then proceed to a vote. Sorry, maybe a further amendment?
No allowed comments.
Okay, comments then. Yes, sorry.
For debate,
comments.
thank you. I have to say, as I said at the previous committee, that when we discussed this, that I actually wanted option 6, which was 2 independent trusts, but I lost that argument. However, I think from my point of view, one single cultural trust is at risk of mission drift. It will be so large, it will contain so many different aspects of culture, which is a very broad term anyway, that actually, 2 independent trusts that have strong governance, good strong governance, with good management that can allow them to find efficiencies, is actually the best way forward, because we could spend years reorganising these trusts again, because CPK is a very relatively new organisation, and actually, we're only achieving savings far down the road, but actually we're distracting from core mission, which should be the focus of these trusts. And actually, if they were to spend their time focusing on their core mission rather than having to deal with reorganisation, I believe that actually we may find a lot of the savings that we need to look for. I think absolutely there's more opportunity for them to work with others and to work together closer in many aspects. And I think we're doing that across the public sector anyway, regardless, due to financial pressure. But I don't necessarily think that means that you need to merge the organisations. So from my point of view, I think the status quo is probably the best position for both the short and the longer term, and we'll be voting accordingly.
Okay. Any other comments? No. Can we go to the vote?
We have a motion by Councillors Lyle and Barrett to approve the report before you today, and an amendment by Councillors Donaldson and McCall to approve the report with the exception of completion of the full business case. If you could indicate, Councillor Baird.
No vote.
Councillor Barrett.
Motion.
Councillor Donaldson.
Amendment.
Councillor Dugan.
Amendment.
Councillor Duff.
Motion.
Councillor Forbes.
Motion.
Councillor Lang.
Amendment.
Councillor Lyle.
Motion.
Councillor McCall. Motion. Councillor McCall.
Amendment.
Councillor McDade.
Amendment.
Councillor McEwen.
Amendment.
Councillor Parrott.
Amendment.
Councillor Purvis. Councillor Stewart.
Motion.
We have a tie with 7 for each motion and amendment. So we'll go to the casting vote.
So my casting vote is for the motion. But I thank you all for your comments and debate, and I'm sure officers have heard them. Given that time is moving on, I suggest that we have a 5-minute comfort break and reconvene at 1:45. Thank you again. We'll reconvene. I'll ask Councillor Stewart to take items 8, 10 and 11, and Councillor Barrett to take items 9 and 13. Councillor Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. So item 8 on the agenda is the Transformation Programme 2015 to 2020. I'd like to invite Mr. Valentine to introduce the paper to the committee.
Thank you, Vice Convener. Councillors, this report gives an update on Phase 4 of the Transformation Programme, with reports on the 14 current live projects as at the end of February 2019. It gives an overview of the progress to date and identifies those on target and those with issues and risks which have been managed by project boards and reported as appropriate to the Corporate Transformation Board. 2 projects were completed as at 28th of February. REACH, which is the REACH implementation project, formerly remodelling of residential care, and expansion of the family-based care. A review of non-cash benefits and learning from these projects and the process will be undertaken in 2019. No savings were attached to these 2 projects. The Cultural Trust Review Transformation Project has now been completed, and a separate report to committee is on the agenda, which you've already heard. I'd be happy to take any questions with regards to this report.
Thank you, Deputy Chief Executive. Are there any questions from members of the committee? No? Okay, well, in that case... Oh. Just too slow in closing that down there. Who was first? Councillor McDade, I think.
Okay, thank you. It's in the appendix. Sorry, I'm not quite sure which of the appendixes. Appendix 2. So I'm just looking at the tracking reports here. And it's around, obviously, the building out ambition, the council assets for commercial sponsorship, which is... there's only 2 that are on target. The rest are either at risk or indeed remedial action required. And I know this has been reported at previous committees around how we plan to take it forward, and I believe in the budget there was a reduction in the target. So has that adjusted this?
Mr. Valentine.
Thank you, Councillor McDade. I'll get Caroline Mackey to update on the detail. The problem with this particular project has been trying to find people who will actually take on sponsorship. the offer that we have is not as large as some other organisations, so there have been some challenges, but Caroline will be able to update you. In fact, Mr McNamara is going to update.
Mr McNamara.
Thanks very much. Yes, Mr Valentine's correct. Yes, there has been an adjustment in the budget. There's a bit of a time lag in terms of this reporting, because that is obviously the adjustment in the budget reflects the current situation. This is historical reporting around sponsorship and advertising, but Mr Valentine's correct. The targets that we had were quite ambitious. What we found is, in relation to some of the things we've tried, there's just not been any takers, or it's been technically unfeasible to do, but we are still confident about bringing significant levels of income through things like roundabout sponsorship, and we've had some positive engagements with industry around sponsorship on council vehicles, and we're going out on a competition basis for that very shortly. So we think we will be able to maybe do slightly better than perhaps we initially thought, but it has been a bit of a learning journey around sponsorship income.
Councillor Dugan next.
Thanks, Vice Convener. Can I make a simple request first, that the headings on Appendix 2 get frozen onto each page? It's really tedious to try and scroll back up to find out which column you're actually looking at. That would be a very helpful improvement to the presentation of the report. The question that I have, because Councillor McDade asked the one about commercial sponsorship, so I'll move directly to the review of catering services within ECS. Let me just scroll up to the heading on the third column across, which is milestones, which it says is on target. That's patently not true. Or sorry, not accurate.
That sounds more like a comment than a question.
Sorry, let me try it again. That's patently not true.
Right, okay, thank you for the inflection at the end of your sentence there. Mr Valentine or Mr Valentine?
I'm happy to take that question, Councillor Stewart. In terms of the agreed position with the Lifelong Learning Committee, we are on target. Lifelong Learning Committee has asked us to look at the implementation plan, so we are still on target in terms of that project. I know that there are other things that are being looked at, but in terms of where we are in the council cycle, it is on target.
So I think that's good to know, Vice Convener, that it's on target in terms of the council's schedule, but the real problem is in terms of deliverability. And Tayside Contracts Joint Committee came here a few weeks ago and tried to approve it at the Joint Committee, but they couldn't, because the final decision as it's being billed hasn't been taken by Perth and Kinross Council, so they're unable to move forward with the full-scale model that they're doing. So I don't see how, in a real meaningful way, that can be on target. You, Vice Convener, as well as I and others, were at the Modernising Governance Member Officer Working Group earlier on this week, whereby we got a presentation from Tayside Contracts. And I wonder if you felt like me that in a bid to try and get us to understand fully the benefits, we simply left the room with more questions than we came in with.
I think we had at the Modernising Governance Member Officer Working Group, I think we had a fairly full and robust questioning session with members from Tayside, representatives from Tayside Contracts there. Certainly there was an issue over whether there was full comprehension between those asking the questions and those answering them about what was actually intended. And I'm glad that I think that we got to the bottom of that during the working group. But I think that a lot of ground was covered and a lot of questions were answered. Any other questions? Councillor McCall.
Thank you, Vice Convener. My question, well, first of all, I would like to endorse Councillor Dugan's comments about the headings, because I'm flitting back and forth, so if I get some of these mixed up, then please bear with me. My question really is around the achieving further savings from procurement activities. It's one of the largest savings targets in this whole plan, and yet the only things that remain on target are the risks, the costs and the non-cashable benefits. Everything else, or every other heading, has some issues. Could you perhaps advise me what some of these other issues are and what the mitigating actions are being taken to try and ensure that we deliver this benefit to the council?
Mr Valentine.
I'll start off and then I'll pass over to Ms Mackey. It has been, the procurement savings have been difficult. We have been working in collaboration with a lot of other councils. We've been working across a wide section of areas. It has moved quicker in some areas than it has in others. But I think I'll pass over to Caroline and allow her to give you some more detail.
Sorry, now switched on. There's quite a lot of detail in the actual Verto reports that we put onto Eric as well, and I'm happy to go through the minutiae of it with you after the committee. However, I can give you some examples of some of the issues in relation to milestones related to contract management and systems development, and the means of reporting on contract performance and risk has been slower than intended, which is obviously then reflected as some of the issues in the overall reporting of the programme. We also participate in national programmes of work developed to support improved contract and supplier management in local authorities, and there's elements there around the lack of evidence and performance metrics in the public sector, and that's then impacting on some of the work we are doing to do evaluation. So we've got work ongoing there. Complexity and devolved management structures for some elements of work are slowing down the rate of improvement. So we want to definitely address these elements as well, and that's again another issue that knocks onto our timing. In relation to savings, opportunities for additional cost savings measures with the IGB were due to be explored during April. This is a piece of work that we've had ongoing for longer than had been anticipated, but we would hope that would again reflect in the savings coming up. What else we've got? We've got work we're doing with housing and environment, where we looked to lever some costs through contract management, and that we tried that and that wasn't as successful as we had hoped. So again, that impacts on the savings balance we have presented. But I'm happy. Is that enough, or would you like me to continue?
Well, I'd like to take you up on your offer of going through it in more detail. I think that would be helpful.
Yeah.
I think my concern really is that it's such a large amount in terms of the overall savings plan, and I am well aware how difficult some of these things are to achieve in terms of quantifiable benefits to the bottom line. So my concern is really around that, Vice Convener, that this committee has confidence that these savings can indeed be achieved, and that we have, and if there are some delays, and I understand why those would be, that we have both credible plans in place to address those risks, but also we have some contingency in terms of this overall transformation programme to still achieve the overall corporate outcomes. And really that was the purpose of my question here.
Thank you, Councillor McCall. Mr Mackenzie, you wanted to come in briefly?
Thank you, Vice Convener. I think it may be useful for Councillor McCall if the Council's Corporate Procurement Manager, Mrs May Mitchell, was part of that discussion. Maybe we can provide you with a level of detail on these issues. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Lane.
Thanks, Vice Convener. I'll take you back to our meeting at the MOG yesterday, and it was through your question and it became apparent that there hadn't been a lot of discussion or understanding from Tayside Contracts about a dual facility, one in Perth and one as the proposed one in Dundee. I have concerns over the grading of these, saying that milestones were on target, issues on targets, savings on target, costs on target. I would question that, because I don't understand where we are with this project. When we have even attending the MOG, etc., I don't understand it. We had the Deputy Provost standing on the steps of this building saying that the final decision has not been taken. So I'm wondering if somebody can illuminate where the final decision about if we're moving forward this project is going to be taken. Is it going to be taken at this committee? Is it going to be taken at any other committee or at full council?
Mr Valentine?
I think the position that the council's in just now, Councillor Lang, is that it reports back to lifelong learning once the implementation plan has been developed. I think the discussions at the MOG, there's obviously a follow-up to that, but that's really in parallel. The council process just now is working towards that implementation plan, which will come back to lifelong learning.
And I think Councillor Lyle wanted to come in on the answer to that as well.
Just as the decision was taken, was my understanding at Lifelong Learning Committee, to work up a business case for the project, to progress the project for the central production unit, and that is the official position of the council. As leader of the council, it would be my ambition that that decision, when we have a decision, or when we have a view and a business case that's competent, that we bring it back to full council.
Thank you very much for that.
Councillor McCune.
Thank you very much. The question I have is around the review of the Housing and Community Care Repair Service, which is at the bottom of page 172. And I noticed about 7 weeks ago there was a project upgrade date meeting. I don't think we have a MOG that covers these projects at this moment in time. So you have a bit of an update on what that meeting had achieved and how this saving is progressing.
Director Renton, if you could take that question.
We're on target to make the saving. The issue for us at the moment is the rollout of our mobile working arrangements, but sort of out of the £500,000 that we've agreed, sort of would be a saving as part of this review, we've already achieved the 300,000 with the expectation that the further 200,000 will be met and delivered this year.
Any other questions? Okay then, well, I've got just one question, which I'll maybe direct to the Chief Executive. It was reflecting on Appendix 1, the projects due to end. We've got 5 projects due to end this year, 10 next year, and then a tailing off of the pipeline. Chief Executive, you wanted to come in and explain about the future for transformation projects.
Okay, thank you, Vice Convener, and I note the comments today in terms of where we are in relation to progress. What I would like to do over a period of time is to review the transformation plan, given it is until 2020 anyway, with a view to actually mainstreaming improvement, because at the end of the day, in every public service in Scotland, improvement is actually the day job. We don't need a shiny, glossy transformation plan sitting out to one side. We also need to take cognizance as we begin to develop the Perth Kinross offer, and actually the Perth Kinross offer becomes the vehicle in which we will transform and continue to modernise this council.
Thank you, Chief Executive. So I'll formally move the report. Committee is asked to note progress in relation to the projects monitored within our transformation programme 2015 to 2020. The paper details the continued work to complete the projects and realise those outcomes originally set out as noted in relation to the 2 projects completed at the end of February. So I would like to formally move the paper.
Happy to second.
Do we have any comments? Councillor Dugan.
Yes, thanks, Vice Convener. Just very quickly to point out that and echo the concerns that Councillor Lang and myself have articulated, that the Central Production Unit in Dundee is not progressing well. And it's a concern for me that in the knowledge that it's not progressing well, it's detailed in a report before this committee that wouldn't give you any indication of the problems that it's currently under. The proposal as it stands at the moment, I understand very clearly, has demonstrable and well quantified benefits for both Dundee City Council and Angus Council. The casualty of this migration of production to Dundee is neither Angus nor Dundee, it is Perth and Kinross. So it's right that councillors on this committee and more broadly across the chamber have concerns, very deeply held concerns about the way that this has progressed. Not the least of those concerns should be, as you and I and others both saw at the Member Officer Working Group earlier on this week, the total absence of a serious consideration for a production facility in Perth, if indeed central production is the way to go, and a kind of almost messianic belief in a one-stop shop for delivery of central production, with no concern whatsoever for jobs in Perth and Kinross, and more broadly the effect that it will have on our economy here in Perth and Kinross for generations to come. It will be a deeply, if this goes ahead, unenviable position for Perth and Kinross to be in, whereby we'll be the only local authority of this size who does not produce the meals for their children in their schools. I'm very pleased by the clarity that's been provided by the leader of the council at this morning's committee, that the final decision on the central production unit in Dundee will be taken by the full council and not a service committee. That's entirely appropriate for a decision whose consequences will have far-reaching effects in terms of time and broad-reaching consequences in terms of every community within Perth and Kinross. And so therefore his decision to do that is to be applauded and is absolutely appropriate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your comments. Yep, Councillor Lyle.
In going through this process, and for the record, as far as I'm concerned, there is no criticism of the work that Tayside Contracts have done to date.
Vice Convener, I would echo the leader of the council's comments. I've held no truck at all or problem at all with the options that Tayside Contracts have put forward, which are entirely consistent with that which they were asked.
Okay, any other comments, or can we agree the paper? Agreed. Thank you.
Thank you. Item 9 on our agenda is the Community Investment Fund and recommendations for the 2019-20 Community Investment Fund based on our experience for year 1. The committee is asked to approve the process and the launch of year 2 next month. We have a presentation from Fiona Robertson, Head of Service. Fiona.
Thank you, Vice Convener. Just very briefly, because this was a large and new way of working for all of us. Again, Strategic Policy and Resources Committee has had updates on how this piece of work has progressed, but we thought it would be helpful to just summarise where we got to with year 1 and the options that are up for your consideration, councillors, for how we run year 2. So I'll just take you through that very quickly, and then Lee Haxton, our community planning manager who has run the scheme during year 1, will be very happy to take questions together with me. Just very briefly, we had a large number of applications in year 1 for the scheme. As you know, there was £600,000 which was available for allocation. We received applications with a total value of just under 1.6 million, and you can see there the distribution of applications from across all the localities in Perth and Kinross. And there is just a very quick headline summary for you of the kinds of projects that funding was eventually allocated to. 105 applications were approved in total, and grant panels across the local action partnership areas agreed to allocate and distribute funding totalling £580,000. The remaining £20,000 which didn't get allocated will be recycled back into year 2. So you can see the kinds of projects that communities were bidding for and considered to be really important in their localities. Points from year 1 which we're taking into year 2, these are set out in section 1 of the paper. Timescales, we've discussed this both around this committee table and with individual councillors several times. Because of SPNR's understandable desire to maintain oversight of how the expenditure was being allocated, we did try to work within the existing timescales for SPNR committee meetings. The final year 1 applications were approved by an executive subcommittee of SPNR, but we tried in planning for year 2 to think about how we make the timescales as streamlined and straightforward as possible, bearing in mind this is a large grant scheme. Governance, lots set out in the report about how the role of the grant ward panels and the role of local action partnerships operated in practice. Capacity, this was a significant new piece of work for the community's team, but I think as our Chief Executive has just alluded to in the context of wider transformation, it is very much part of the day job. It now sits within that broader sweep of community empowerment and community participation, which we're all trying to work to secure. Me and my team have certainly learned lessons about how we can administer this as effectively as possible and support you as ward councillors. And communications, a lot there about how we make the criteria and the application process as straightforward as possible. There are 4 options for you to consider about how Year 2 operates, and they're set out in Section 2 of the report. I'll just summarise them briefly, and then I'm sure you'll have questions. So status quo is to carry on the same process that we've used in Year 1. That involves grant panels for each ward who consider applications and make recommendations to the local action partnership. The local action partnership in turn makes recommendations to this committee, which approves them or rejects them. Option 2 is to devolve the decisions entirely to local action partnerships. That would remove the need for grant panels and it would hand the responsibility to LAPs. Option 3 is a hybrid option whereby grants of £9,999 or less would be agreed at local level by local action partnerships, but still with grant panels advising local action partnerships. Anything of £10,000 or over would come to Strategic Policy and Resources Committee for decision. And option 4 is to run a participatory budgeting process in each locality. I think you're all familiar with participatory budgeting and how that operates. There are pros to it and there are cons. So those are the options for your consideration. Councillors Lee and myself are happy to take questions.
Thanks very much for that, Fiona. Do we have any questions? Councillor Parrott.
Thank you, Vice Convener. First, can I say I'm delighted to see this paper coming forward. I think that the first round of the Community Investment Fund worked reasonably well, but I think everyone recognised that there were possible changes and improvements can be made, and I'm delighted to see this paper addresses those. My question specifically is, can I ask why participatory budgeting was seen as perhaps a separate complete option, and is there scope for an element of participatory budgeting to be built into any of the other options so that a portion of the monies might be done by participatory budgeting under the other 3 options, but most of that money left as CIF? Thanks.
Thanks very much for your question, and I appreciate your enthusiasm and appreciation of the process. It's always been my understanding that if a local action partnership wanted to allocate part of its SIF, towards a participatory budgeting scheme, then that was perfectly within their remit, but I can get Fiona to clarify that, or Dave.
Sorry, thank you for the question. The PB model would fit under option 2, which is the devolved decision making by the LAPs if action partnerships wanted to do a combination of panels or pure PB, or however you wanted to divide that could be done as long as it was consistent with the criteria and we maintain the timelines really for delivery, but that would be something for council and the individual action partnerships to decide.
Okay, and could you clarify, Dave, whether, because as I say, it was my understanding that with the existing schemes that if action partnerships had wanted to allocate part of their SIF monies for a PB scheme, they would have been able to do that under the current arrangements?
Yeah, the way we addressed that was if any group themselves wanted to apply to run participatory budgeting events, and they could do that again, they would need to fit the criteria for that. As you know, some of the action partnerships ran PB themselves this year, and there was also money from Scottish Government in some areas, which went directly to community groups. So there has still been PB activity across the localities.
Thank you.
Could I just make a point of clarification on that?
Certainly,
if possible?
Councillor Purvis.
My understanding was the same as that of Councillor Barrett, not just in relation to if a group wanted to apply to do participatory budgeting, but in the original SPNR paper it was set out that the ward panel had to demonstrate that there was community engagement and involvement in the process as to how they reached the decisions. Now, for most, having community councillors and having local action partnership members was sufficient in and of itself, but I do recall that if they had wanted to, not that any did, they could have done participatory budgeting to decide how all or part of the actual applications were determined.
Yes, that's correct, Councillor Purvis.
Okay. Councillor Lane?
So just for clarity, the original question by Councillor Parrott about having participated budget could actually be in the status quo option as well, and not necessarily in option 2.
I think that's the clarification that we have received. You know. So. Are there any further questions? Councillor McCall.
This is really a question of clarification. My understanding is that this community investment fund is ward specific, yet the local area partnerships cover sometimes multiple wards, and therefore the participatory budgeting process they employ isn't necessarily ward specific. Is that correct, or am I misunderstanding that?
I think we're talking hypotheticals here, and it would be, you know, up to certainly the SIF monies are ward specific at £50,000 per ward. If there was to be collaboration within local action partnerships across wards, then I think that's entirely a matter for that local action partnership. Does that concur with the officer's view?
Yes, that's correct, Vice Convener. I think it's an interesting point now, and I think Lee may want to add to this, but in Perth City in particular, there were some discussions about some of the applications in terms of whether the projects were ward specific or whether actually they would deliver wider benefits across the city centre as a whole. Lee, do you want to answer that?
I think Fiona's comments are clear on that. So yes, we did have a number of conversations with some ward councillors about the opportunity of the ward panels collaborating effectively for projects which are seen to deliver benefits across Perth City, which is perhaps the clearest example, but there were other examples where there were transboundary benefits, but the application could only be considered in one ward.
Okay, are there any other further questions? Go on then, Councillor Parrott.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you, Vice Convener. I'm just asking, we're proposing to run in 2 tranches this year. Is there any fixed split of the monies for those 2 tranches, or would it be possible to spend it all on the first tranche and not run a second tranche? Is that going to be left to the action partnerships, or is there some predetermination of that? Thanks.
It's not a question I've either thought of or encountered before. Is there a response to
Yeah, we're leaving that decision for ward panels and local action partnerships. If they wish to spend the full amount in the first tranche, then that's absolutely fine.
I mean, I think there are benefits to having it in 2 tranches, given, you know, communities' abilities to work up ideas. Then I think maybe there's a certain sense to having 2 different tranches. Are there any other questions? No. Okay. In which case, I'm happy to move the following. I want to say that the first year of the Community Investment Fund has been a great success, as this report and the presentation demonstrate. The SIF, as we've heard, generated interest from 149 applicants, with over £579,000 being awarded to 105 successful applicants. We've had very positive feedback from the local action partnerships, and have used the views of chairs and lead officers to strengthen and improve the proposals for year 2. We are being asked today to decide between one of the 4 options. Each of the options aims to balance our aim of making sure that local people are deciding where council investment is best spent, alongside the legitimate role of elected members in maintaining oversight of public funds, and a way of working that is not disproportionately resource intensive. For me, it is really important that the local action partnerships continue to have the flexibility and resource to be able to respond with agility to their communities' needs and to tackle inequalities within their communities without being burdened by excessive council bureaucracy. My take on the feedback from the Modernising Governance Member Officer Working Group that we've discussed previously was that members had no appetite for either option 2 or option 4, being the fully devolved decisions to lapse or a move to full participatory budgeting. There certainly seemed to be a preference to retain the year one way of working and to enable the process to bed in even. So I'd like to thank all the community members and councillors who sat on their local awards panel and gave large numbers of hours of their time and energies to read and assess the many applications that we received. I believe that this is community empowerment in action, and I'm happy to move option 1 of the report.
Happy to second.
Okay, is there an amendment? Councillor McDade.
Not necessarily an amendment. I was wondering, Vice Convener, if you might consider, as part of your motion, lowering the base threshold so that some of the community groups who wanted to apply but didn't necessarily have a project that was worth 3,000 might be able to apply. Maybe the local action partnership could set the base threshold.
Yeah, I have heard a number of members raise this point, Councillor McDade. It's not something that I'm inclined to agree to be honest. It is meant to be a large grants scheme. There are alternative sources of funding for people who are looking for small grants, and I think through the work of the action partnerships and officers that people who are looking for smaller amounts of money either can be directed to other sources of grant funding for those smaller amounts. So I'm not inclined to take that on. Fiona, do you want to?
Yes, thank you, Vice Convener. I think just a brief reminder that the reason for the £3,000 threshold, Councillor McDade, was set because there are a number of other grant schemes operated by the council which fund projects of up to £3,000, and one of the things we were trying to do was not confuse the landscape for community applicants. Also worth mentioning that each local action partnership has an allocation of £25,000 as part of its core funding, which it can distribute to projects in its locality, and that is really intended for some of the smaller, maybe a few £100s would make a lot of difference, and the local action partnerships have got the ability to distribute those grants.
So I think there are alternative sources of funding available to meet the needs of those potential applicants. So did you want to come back, Councillor McDade?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that point, and I understood that originally we were looking to hand out larger sums of money, although I think if you look through the awards that were granted, some of them were below 3,000, because obviously we were trying to make the money go as far as possible. But it was also something that had been, community groups had said to me that they would have applied for smaller amounts of capital funding, etc., about 2,000, etc. And some people, I think, did feel that they maybe needed to just pad up their application to 3,000 to make it, go to 3,000 so that they could apply.
Okay. Are there any amendments to my motion? No. Can we agree with the report? Okay, thank you.
I think it's a typo. It refers to paragraph 2.3, and I don't think there is one.
No, I think I spotted that as well, Councillor McCall.
Yeah, it's just really just for the record, just so we update that and make it correct.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Now move on to item 10.
Okay, so item 10 in the agenda is managing unreasonable demands policy. Deputy Chief Executive, if you would like to introduce this paper for committee.
Thank you, Vice Convener. This is really an update on a policy that we had previously in place dealing with unreasonable demands. This applies to both elected members and to council staff. It is a process that we have in place and it is to deal with persistent offenders in terms of contact with individuals. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Deputy Chief Executive. Councillor Parrott is first.
Thank you, Vice Convener. First of all, can I say I think it's entirely appropriate to have this sort of policy in place, that it's not fair that council staff are subjected to, if you like, unfair pressure or demands, however they're expressed. However, in reading the policy, I'm a little concerned that it appears to make no provision for those who, by way of physical infirmity or mental infirmity, may actually have difficulty expressing themselves and difficulty coming through to officers, which may, in a sense, raise the temperature and leads to them being seen as unreasonable. And I just wonder whether there's any scope for the policy to encompass some sort of consideration of the formal consideration of individuals' mental state of health and physical state of health. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Parrott. I would imagine that council staff across the piece would be fully cognisant and engaged with our responsibilities under, the Qualities Act and so on. But I don't know if one of the officers would like to come back on that. Head of Legal and Governance, Mrs Simpson, please.
Councillor Parrott, can I provide some assurance? And just to put this policy into context, this is one of a vast suite of engagement and communication policies that the council has. So there already are clear protocols in terms of how we manage vulnerable customers and applicants. This is about providing a toolkit really for persistent and unreasonable demands and unmanageable demands on officer time, where there perhaps is no solution that can be given, an outcome can't be achieved, or it's verging on harassment or bombarding with emails or whatever. But this is a very much a last resort, and I think we need to remember that we've had a policy like this around complainants for a number of years, and it's very, very rarely applied. I mean, it really is high-end and in quite extreme cases. But as I say, you need to put into context, we have a wide variety of suite in terms of how we engage with customers, which would allay some of the fears around dealing with people with particular vulnerabilities.
Thanks for that reassurance. I still, and I accept it's part of a larger suite of documents and policies. But I suppose I still have a concern that within this policy itself, there is actually no mention at all of, if you like, the fact that certain people may have difficulties which might be seen as unreasonable. Thanks.
Councillor Parrott, I'm more than happy before we publish this policy to go and put in some amendments around the text to reflect these concerns.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Forbes, you had a question.
Thank you, Vice Convener. I wonder if I could ask the Deputy Chief Executive or whoever else is appropriate to answer, just for a very broad outline of what the difference is between this policy and the previous one, what the updates are.
The previous policy only applied to people who were involved in the formal complaints process. So within the corporate complaints process, there is a specific bit about when there is a cut-off and when there's, how we can manage some of these very occasional difficult cases. But it didn't extend to people who are just engaging with the council on a day-to-day basis. And we have thousands of interactions with customers across the piece on a daily basis, and there's very, very few where this policy would arrive. But if the existing policy only applied to the corporate complaints process, so what we've actually done is simply widened the policy to reflect day-to-day interaction so that we can manage customer expectation and manage behaviour.
Thank you. Councillor McDade.
Thank you, Vice Convener. The Head of Legal and Governance sort of drawn my attention to the fact that we use the term customers in the policy, and just personally, I feel that we should really refer to them as members of the public, as it's a public body, we're serving them. So I would prefer in future for consideration that we don't use the term customers.
Were you putting an interrogative inflection on the end of that statement to make it a question, Councillor McDade?
Asking officers to consider that in future we might not call them customers.
I think the Chief Executive will come back on that.
Very simply, Councillor McDade, your point is noted.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Okay, in that case I'll formally move the report. The policy represents a small but important part of the Council's approach to customer service. As detailed in the paper, the Council has had a policy in place for managing unacceptable behaviour on the part of complainants, but the amended policy extends that coverage to all individuals who interact with the Council. Given the breadth of our business, the Council has thousands of interactions with the public on a daily basis, and we're committed to open communication and working hard to meet the expectations of our customers. In a very few of these cases, however, the expectation of the customer may be unreasonable, and or their attitude and behaviour towards staff might be otherwise unacceptable. And there are a number of examples where that might arise. So the aim of the policy is simply to provide tools to manage those very few difficult cases, and will only be applied where there is evidence to justify its application. And protection is given to individuals in the paper by way of a right of appeal, which closely mirrors that of the Scottish Public Service Ombudsman's own policy. I would also note that usages of the policy are to be reported on an annual basis to the Scrutiny Committee as per section 4.3 of the report, and therefore if Council were in future unhappy about any application of the policy, there would be the opportunity to scrutinise that. So therefore I'm going to formally move the report, recognising the opportunity for the Head of Legal and Governance to slightly amend the wording to incorporate the observations raised by Councillor Parrott earlier. Can I have a seconder?
Happy to second with amendment.
Comments then. I'll open it to Councillor McDade.
Thank you, Vice Convener. I think this is a very sensible policy. Having seen in another public body a similar policy in use, it does show our staff that we're taking the duty of care to them very seriously, and allows us to manage individuals who might be presenting difficult behaviour, and actually tends to deliver, in my view, a better outcome for everyone, because that individual who might be firing off lots of emails to lots of different people actually then gets a single point of contact, etc., which provides them the reassurance. But I think it's important for our staff that they know that we are fully behind them, and I think this is a very sensible policy, and probably will save the Council time and money through saving resources.
Thank you, Councillor McDade. Councillor Forbes.
Thank you, Vice Convener. I'm delighted to hear that this also extends to elected members, having just in the last hour received the daily email from a constituent in my ward telling me exactly what he thinks about me. So I'm pleased to hear that. I also noticed the word customers, and I want to pick up on what Councillor McDade said, because I actually disagree with Councillor McDade, and I think it's appropriate for us to refer to the people as customers. We do have a customer service centre, and I think if you treat people as customers, then they expect to be treated as customers, and I would suggest that we carry on referring to them as customers. Thank you.
Okay, that comment is also noted. Are there any other comments? The one thing that I perhaps didn't just touch on in my formal moving of the paper was the fact that obviously this is a policy which will assist staff in carrying out their duties. It is nice to see the balance that we're going to get with the item 13 on the agenda later in the meeting. Otherwise, can we agree the paper? Thank you very much. Oh, it's still me. So item 11 on the agenda then is the proposed health and well-being framework. Is this Mr. Valentine again? No, Mrs. Donaldson. If you would like to introduce the paper.
Good afternoon, councillors. Last year, Healthy Working Lives was identified as one of the key strands of the Council's workforce strategy. And this recognised the fact that the Council cares about the health and well-being of its people, and that we are reliant on their talent and their effort to deliver services to our communities. So we recognise that this is about much more than physical health. It's also about psychological, financial and social well-being too. And as a large employer, we recognise our reach goes well beyond those who are directly employed by us. Our commitments to caring about the health and well-being of our staff will be core to redefining the relationship the Council has with its employees as we develop the Perth Kinross offer, valuing the relationships between line managers and their employees in day-to-day working. The new framework set out in Appendix 1 to the report sets out the importance of leadership in developing a well-being and performance culture. It focuses on the tools and support which are available for ill health prevention, early intervention, and building resilience for both individual employees and also for the organisation. And for the first time, all employees of the Council will be covered by the same arrangements for managing sickness absence from work. In a workplace context, being well is about being the best version of yourself at work. And this is important because it leads to improved productivity, reduced sickness absence and better resilience. The framework has been developed with employees, managers and trade unions who have been involved since the outset, and they welcome its introduction. The new arrangements strike a balance between policy direction and manager discretion. The framework will touch everyone in the organisation. Implementation will be rolled out with awareness raising, training and promotion of tools and support. We've identified, like most organisations, we have seen an increase in absences attributed to poor mental health, and this will be a priority area as we roll out the framework and develop new tools and support for managers and employees alike. We will monitor the effectiveness of the new framework through feedback on experiences from employees, managers and trade unions, absence levels and evaluation of specific campaigns and interventions to ensure that we continue to focus on the right things. We've carried out an equality impact assessment to ensure that this policy promotes equality and doesn't adversely impact on any equality group. I'm happy to respond to any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mrs Donaldson. Questions then. Councillor Donaldson.
Thank you. Councillor Stewart, as with your previous your question in the previous section under section 10, the same applies here. I'd like to ask, with what has been put forward, what is distinctive with this compared to previous arrangements and procedures? And let me just be devil's advocate for a moment, that one might almost say that this is a disciplinary and appeals process, a policy for dealing with absences, but one that we're dealing with on a much more compassionate and humane basis, and one of greater concern for employees of the Council.
Mrs Donaldson.
I think it's fair to say that the Council has always treated its employees with care and kindness and compassion when they experience periods of ill health and that result in absence from work. Some of the main changes within this framework is it's actually pulling together everything into one place so that we have a much more coherent approach to looking at the health and well-being of our employees in its entirety in the round, and ensuring that we have a much more cohesive and way of taking that out into the organisation. One of the major differences between what we're proposing now and what we have at the moment is that there's quite a lot of prescription within the current arrangements about you have to have certain types of meetings, etc. And what we've found in practice is that in an authorising environment, that kind of regime doesn't particularly fit very well. What we want to do is to focus on the quality of relationships between line managers and employees, so that you don't have to go into a formal meeting to have a meaningful and caring conversation that would enable an employee to discuss any health and wellbeing issues that they had, and enable the appropriate support to be put in place. And where employees are absent, clearly we would wish to support an employee in returning to work at the earliest opportunity. And our experience is that sometimes when you do this within a formal setting, it doesn't actually achieve the desired results. So we're trying to move away from the prescription of mandatory meetings and looking at much more focused wellbeing conversations with our staff.
Councillor Donaldson.
Can I just say thank you? I think what you're really saying, it's a word I dislike, but you're taking a more holistic approach. Could I just ask one thing, though, because I think absences are quite a good indication. How do we compare on that front with other councils throughout Scotland on benchmarking?
Okay, we had a report to the council, I think back in February, on the local government benchmarking framework. So we look at sickness absence for local government employees, and we look at sickness absence for teachers. In terms of absence levels for local government employees in general, we sit in the middle of the league table. For teachers, we're much closer to the bottom. Having said that, the absence level for teachers is still below that of the rest of the council workforce. So that's how we fare, and that's what we reported to council back in February.
So there's scope with a new approach to raise it, to improve those figures?
Absolutely. We're hoping that the new framework, as it's deployed and implemented across the organisation, will help us reduce sickness absence levels, as well as improve productivity, morale, etc. as well. So it has multi outcomes intended.
Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor McEwen.
Thank you very much. Does the council have a policy related to absence around the diarrhea and vomiting bugs like norovirus? Because patients without symptoms can be still be symptomatic and pass these bugs on to their colleagues at work if they return to work too soon.
Mrs. Donaldson.
We expect our employees to use their personal judgment in terms of their fitness for returning to work. Within certain workplaces, such as those involving working with vulnerable adults and vulnerable children, there tends to be an exclusion period. So when somebody has recovered, then there's meant to be a 48-hour period that they remain absent from work. But that applies only to certain workplaces. But we are expecting our employees to use their common sense and judgment in terms of when they present themselves for work. Perhaps by way of explanation, we did an analysis of duration of absences related to sickness and diarrhea, so we have actually had a deep dive into our statistics to have a look at that. And the duration of absences attributable to sickness and diarrhea, etc., they're actually quite short.
I would only further comment that I think the council should reflect on the policies of NHST side on these issues and see how it meets up with their own ones and come to conclusions.
Okay, I'll turn that into a question and say, yeah, I'm sure somebody will, by providing way of answer, I'm sure somebody will reflect on that. Councillor McDade.
Thank you, Vice Convener. You mentioned that the policy has been quality impact assessed. However, are potentially up to 1 in 10 employees who might be colourblind like me may well struggle to read the policy because significant amounts of the headings and indeed some of the bodies of the text are in colour, and it makes it very difficult to read in such, given that this is such an important policy where people might receive disciplinary action, etc. as part of it. I think that's something we perhaps should be looking at and wider as well in terms of policies that staff are expected to know and read.
I think we'll take that on board as a comment rather than a question. Councillor McCall.
Thank you, Vice Convener. First of all, I'd just like to thank officers for the sterling work they've done on this and indeed the previous report. I chair the Corporate Health, Safety and Wellbeing Consultative Committee, and I attend the Employee Joint Consultative Committee, and I think the engagement with employees and staff representatives has been exemplary. My question really is around the implementation of this and whether or not I can seek some assurance that there will be ongoing, the same level of ongoing consultation and collaboration with staff representatives and staff to ensure that the benefits expected from this policy will be realised, and to also ensure that if there needs to be adjustments as it goes through the process, that these will be recognised and acted upon.
Thank you, Councillor McCall. I am absolutely confident that the answer to that question is yes, but Mrs McDonaldson will confirm.
I can give you that assurance. This will be a regular item that we bring to both the Joint Consultative Committee and the Joint Negotiating Committee for Teachers. It's the way we do business, working collaboratively with our trade unions and professional associations. We have a mutual respect, and we work together when we have a common aim in terms of looking after the people and their members. So I think that's how we do our business.
Okay, all done for questions? I will formally move the report then. Time is pressing on, so I'll just actually formally move it if I can have a seconder.
Happy to second.
Any comments? Can we agree the report? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Councillor Stewart. I'm also aware of time. We move on to the next item 12, retirement scheme, and Mr. Valentine. I have to introduce, but no, Mrs. Donaldson's going to do it for him.
Okay, as you know, the Council has a comprehensive set of arrangements in place to manage and develop its workforce, and these are kept under review to ensure that they remain relevant to the emerging needs of the Council. The report before you today proposes updates to the retirement scheme, which covers employees who are members of the local government pension scheme. The retirement scheme provides a range of retirement options for our employees and is an important tool for managers to use in supporting business change and organisational transformation. It sets out 4 main types of retirement: flexible, voluntary early retirement in the interests of efficiency of the service, and retirement on grounds of redundancy. The main provisions are rooted in the legislation which governs the local government pension scheme, with local application of policy discretion approved by the Council and procedural arrangements to meet local circumstances. The revised scheme in Appendix 1 to the report reflects changes in the local government pension scheme as they relate to voluntary early retirement, with amendments to ensure the options for retirement are fit for purpose, and there's also a review of some administrative arrangements. There are 2 changes worthy of highlighting: the reduction from 3 to 2 years for periods of flexible retirement, with the possible extension of up to 2 years. And secondly, the removal of the policy discretion to award added years in early retirement in the interest of efficiency of the service and on grounds of redundancy, which would be effective for retirees after 31st of March 2020. The Council has successfully used voluntary severance schemes which are based on the terms of the retirement scheme to facilitate workforce change and, importantly, to deliver significant annual recurring savings to the Council. Again, an equality impact assessment has been carried out to ensure the policy change doesn't adversely impact on any equality group. Our trade unions have been consulted and feedback incorporated as appropriate. And I'm happy to, again, answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Convener. I had a brief discussion with the Head of Finance in the recess, but perhaps either the Head of Legal and Governance or the Chief Executive could give more insight into my questions, which are on early retirement. Obviously, there's been a lot of coverage in the press, both locally and nationally, about this issue. Although legislation was passed, I think, in England and Wales, the Enterprise Act in 2016, to look at a cap on the total value of exit payments for employees in the public sector, which would include any cost to the employee of accessing pension early as well, that the necessary, I'm not sure whether it's statutory instruments or what it was, wasn't put in place, but now that's going to happen, so there will be a total cap of £95,000 on exit payments in England and Wales. Obviously that doesn't apply to Scotland and is referenced in the report at 2.8 about some of the ongoing discussions that have been happening in relation to what will happen in in Scotland, sorry. I'd be grateful if there's two parts to this question. One, if I could get some further clarification on where that's at and what's happening at the moment in terms of those discussions and when we're likely to see an outcome of those. But secondly, is it within the competence of the Council to voluntarily emulate the policy of the UK government and to introduce a cap at a similar level?
I'm happy to answer your question. We were aware of the provisions within the Small Business Enterprise and Employment Act back in 2015 that gave talk of a £95,000 cap along with other conditions. The consultation for England and Wales on the implementation of that provision has only just started in the last week or so. So the government is now taking steps to look at putting that into place. The provisions within Scotland are different, and in 2017 the Scottish Government commenced its own consultation exercise, and it was referenced as a consultation on a severance policy for Scotland. And this was examining the practices and policy arrangements across the whole of the public sector in Scotland. So that was quite an extensive consultation paper that involved the professional bodies that support local government as well as other public sector organisations. I'm a member of the Society of Personnel and Development, and I know that Stuart Mackenzie is a member of a similar Heads of Finance group. And we have regular updates in terms of the passage of what's happening with that consultation paper at Scottish Government level. And as of last month, when at a recent meeting, there was no indication of the steps that the Scottish Government were going to take in relation to implementing any similar arrangements to England and Wales. However, we did have informal feedback that indicated that across the public service in Scotland, there is quite variation in terms of the governance arrangements and the policy arrangements that they have in place. And the comment was made that local government on the whole has robust arrangements in place. And there was an indication that it was unlikely the Scottish Government was going to legislate for similar controls as was happening in England and Wales. Instead, there seemed to be a preference for looking at technical guidance on how organisations would account for and do the business case analysis for working out whether any early retirement request was affordable or not. So that is the update on the position within Scotland. Your second question was whether it would be appropriate for the Council to voluntarily apply a cap. It could be a matter of local policy decision making. However, I think that that was not the view or the recommendations that was voiced by the professional bodies that represent finance, HR, etc. within Scotland. Again, referencing the quite robust controls that we do actually have in place. And that wasn't the officer recommendation that we've incorporated within the report, and I'm aware of no other council in Scotland who's even considering that as a way forward.
Thank you. Chief Executive.
Thank you, Convener. Councillor Purvis, like you and many others in the room today, I acknowledge the recent national and local media coverage in relation to this specific matter. I would like to provide some form of reassurance, however, that, as you're aware, every council has a statutory responsibility for best value in its decision making. The policy in front of you today sets out to limit and reduce, indeed, discretions and benefits, and therefore I strongly believe it enhances decision making, transparency and accountability in the use of public funds. I'd also like to remind members that the scheme of administration ensures that any decision is brought back to committee. And to echo the comments from Karen Donaldson, if we were to look at a potential cap, we would also have to look at the contractual obligations that we hold as an employer.
Okay, any further questions? Councillor McDoid.
Yeah, thank you very quickly. It's page 233. It's the 2.6, and it's a maximum of 2, 4, and then 6 and 2/3 added for 10, 20, and 30 years. I'm just wondering why we've got 2/3, 6 and 2/3 at the end there, as opposed to 2, 4, 6.
That comes from the regulations themselves.
Thank you.
Councillor McCall.
Thank you, Convener. My question, I think, is for the Head of Finance. On page 236, section 2.1, the Head of Finance has confirmed there are no financial costs directly associated with the proposals contained in this report. Can the Finance Manager confirm that there has been a financial impact assessment or modelling done by the Pension Fund Actuary?
Apologies, Councillor McCall. In terms of the proposals in the report, no, there has been no modelling done by the pension fund actually, because what the committee being asked to approve is actually a reduction in the discretions which sit with the council in terms of the award of added compensatory years. So the direction of the report is actually to reduce cost of early retirements rather than increase cost of early retirements. But just to remind and advise committee that early retirements are looked at on a case-by-case basis and assessed against a payback period, with the intention being that any approvals which are granted will generate recurring savings to the council.
Okay, if no further questions, I'll move the paper. It's good practice to review our policies and procedures to ensure that they remain relevant and demonstrate best use of public funds, and they deliver the changes in workforce that we need as a council to modernise and transform. The amendments to the retirement scheme before us today do just that. I'm happy to move the paper.
Formally second. Item 13 is the policy and framework for delivery of successful engagement in housing and environment, and the Deputy Director will speak to the paper.
Thank you, Vice Convener. I'll try to be brief in view of the time. Good afternoon, councillors. Housing and environment can point to many examples of very positive consultation and engagement practice. However, we do recognise that this is not consistent across the service, and we've reached this recognition from feedback from elected members, from our stakeholders, from our own self-evaluation activities, and also benchmarking against national guidance on community engagement standards. This report recognises an opportunity for improvement, and the purpose of this report is to recognise the significant benefits of greater consultation and engagement by better meeting the needs of our customers and communities when we work with them in the design and delivery of services, to deliver this consistently, and also to meet best practice both nationally and also learn from the fantastic practice which exists within the service and within the council. The proposals comprise a policy statement which sets out our objective and what's expected of everyone within the service, a framework which acts as a tool for colleagues and also those groups and individuals that we influence, such as contractors and partnerships. And the next stage would be to develop up an action plan subject to agreement of the report today. So we're asking for your approval of the policy and framework at this stage, and also for us to come back in a year's time with our findings from this. The other learning that we wish to take from this is use this as a model and a pilot for potential rollout to the rest of the council, learning from experiences in housing and environment. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you for that. Keith, are there any questions? No. I'm happy to move the report formally.
Formally second.
Councillor McDade.
Very quick comment, just to say thank you to the Executive Director for bringing this forward, because I've made representation a few times to her in recent times about various aspects of engagement, and I think it's very positive that this is going to be looked at and potentially rolled across the council, so thank you.
Councillor Forbes.
Thank you, Vice Convener. Just following on from the earlier point we discussed about whether we refer to people as customers, I noticed we refer to them in this report as service users, so perhaps we could agree across council on how we refer to people. We do all regularly hear from customers about how we communicate or don't with them. It's good to see that we now have some standards to refer to. And I know it's difficult to put this into paper. We're dealing largely with vague processes which will be different in different situations. So as has already been said, this is not the finished article. I believe it's the beginning of a process which will constantly evolve. I'd like to also congratulate Director Renton, Deputy Director McNamara on bringing this report forward. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Councillor Stewart.
Thank you, Vice Convener. I would like to add my thanks to Director Renton and also specifically my thanks to Deputy Director McNamara for giving me a sneak preview of the policy before it came forward, and the opportunity to just reflect back some of the points that I thought might help it along the way, in particular in recognition of issues that had been raised within my ward, and look forward to this providing very sound foundation for moving forward in the relationship between the Council and our taxpayers.
I don't want to be accused of omitting Councillor McCall if she wants in. No? Thank you very much.
Okay.
Can we agree the report? Thank you. And that concludes today's meeting. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming along this morning and for your time, patience and contributions.